Good morning. Good morning. My name is Ilaria Saccani, and I'm glad to welcome you to this webinar, Materials and Method for Public Art Conservation. I just would like to give you, first of all, some technical details. Here you see there is a simultaneous interpretation from Italian into English. You can click on the globe icon in the toolbar. Please select the English language and click on Mute Original Audio. As for the question and answers, please use the chat. In particular, you can specify the speaker's name to whom you would like to address the question and, if possible, the speech you are referring to. Thank you.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I will start in English just for this introduction. It is a great pleasure for me to be here today and open the webinar Materials and Methods for Public Art Conservation, organized by CESMA 7 within the frame of the Capus project. My name is Domenica Scalarone. I'm a professor of chemistry at the University of Torino, Italy, and I'm coordinator of Capus project. Before giving the floor to Ilaria Saccani, organizer of this webinar, I will brief the project Conservation of Art in Public Spaces. This project officially started in January 2018 and involves 14 partners, 6 higher education institutes, 2 research centers, 4 companies, 1 NGO, and 1 museum based in 5 different countries of the European Union, Italy, Germany, Croatia, Poland, and Spain. Capus is a project funded by the European Commission under the Erasmus Plus Knowledge Alliances program. Of course, the topic of conservation of public art is controversial and still debated. Street art, for example, is often considered an ephemeral form of art by the same artists. But it is also true that where a street community, the will and need to preserve it clearly emerges. This was the starting point of the Capus project. The project aims at 2 main results. The first is drafting of conservation guidelines for urban art, and the other one is the definition of a specific training module to be included in academic curricula. This is the project work plan, which consists of 4 main phases. The analysis of the socio-cultural context, including the selection of case studies, interviews with artists, and a digital repository of the artworks studied within Capus, including general information, photo documentation, condition and laboratory reports, and archival documents. Work package 2 was followed by a more scientific phase aimed at identifying the constituent materials and decay processes and testing materials and conservation treatments. Work package 5 was aimed at conservation guidelines, but another important result of this work package was a glossary of street art and conservation terms, containing a definition of terms related to street art and conservation treatments to be used for describing a characteristic of street artworks and their conservation state. Finally, work package 6 is devoted to education and foresees 3 main outcomes. First of all, a teaching module addressed to teachers of higher education institutes. Then an e-learning module addressed to university students and experts in conservation who want to deepen their knowledge and understanding of the problems and specificities of conservation interventions on complex public artworks, especially murals and painted metal sculptures. These results will be presented at the final event of the project at the beginning of June. And the third outcome are workshops for professional restorers, of which 2 days webinar represents the virtual version to which we had to adapt due to the pandemic situation. I invite you to follow the news of Carpus project on our social media channels and by visiting our website. Now, I wish you a fruitful participation in the webinar. I thank you for your attention, and I leave the floor to Ilaria Saccani, President of CESMAR 7.
Thank you, Dominique. Thank you for your introduction on the project. I would like to talk about the agenda. So today's agenda, and I will also mention other meetings related to the project that we are going to have in the future. This is the first day of this webinar. We will start with first introduction of the evolution of mural art in public spaces by Maria Fratelli e Alessandra Tibiletti, and then we'll give the floor to Clara Amodeo, a journalist and street art expert, so she is pretty much into this topic, and her speech is about urban art between spontaneity and everything else. And then we will have a Q&A session, and then the third speech will be on methodological issues, artists, interviews, and dialogue with context by Grazia Cavanna and Alessandra Tibiletti. And then today, the last speech will be on materials and techniques by Roberto Bestetti. And then we will have the Q&A session concerning the 2 last speeches. As for tomorrow, we will get into the details of the action and of the planning intervention. So we will focus on materials characterization and degradation, and then there will be the consolidation treatment by Davide Ricciardi, and a speech on cleaning of contemporary murals. And then on Saturday, we will start our session with the biologist Matteo Montanari on the control of biodeterioration and how to treat contemporary murals, and then the second speech will be on coatings and protection by Michele Bertioli and myself. On Saturday, we will have a presentation of case studies from participants and a round table, and we will have, therefore, questions related to these two speeches of Saturday, but also questions concerning the other speeches. So if you want to take part in this roundtable as attendee, please contact this email by today and just apply to participate as a speaker of this roundtable with a short presentation of 5 minutes, and then please give us a short abstract and a short biography, so introducing who you are. And so it's with a great pleasure that I will present next CAPUS meeting concerning the final conference, which will be held June 21, the first half of the month, so at the beginning of June. It will be a digital conference on Zoom, 2 half days, and we will see the participation of the partners and international experts. So during these 2 days, we will talk about the project outcomes, and we will describe all the project deliverables, so what we produced during the project, exactly as Dominic said at the beginning. We will then introduce the digital repository, which is already available, and all the other project outcomes. The event will be soon launched on the different communication channels, so CAPUS project and all the other partners. It's a free of charge event. Of course, you have to register and to sign in. So I invite you to follow the CAPUS communication channels in order to take note of this event and 2 dates. I would like to thank, first of all the partners, because these 3 days we will talk about, of course, project results, project outcomes, so not just related to CESMAR and Antares. So I would like to thank all the project partners and all the associated partners, Municipality of Milan, Turin, and Municipality of Reggio Emilia. And on behalf of CESMAR 7, I would like to thank our close partners who played a very important role in developing this project, the University Ca' Foscari in Venice, the team of Mrs. Zenderi, Francesca Caterina Izzo, Daphne Cimino, and Raffaella La Muraglia. Her university degree project was fundamental in order to develop some aspects of this work, and Danilo Bersari and the University of Ghent, Peter van den Avele's team for the ramen analysis on site. I also would like to thank Officine Educativa, Circolo Arci Pigaglia, Ampi Niguarda in Milan. Now I give the floor to the first speaker, Mrs. Maria Fratelli and Alessandra Tibiletti. I would like to introduce you Maria Fratelli. She's an art historian. She has been working for over 20 years for the Civici Musei Milanesi, and today she is director of the Casa Museo Boschi di Stefano, and she is also a managing director of the Casa della Memoria and a member of the scientific committee of Cesma Sette, and in particular focusing on conservation, restoration, and the collections in museums. So now I give the floor to Maria, talking about evolution of mural art in public spaces. Good morning. I'm sharing my presentation. Please let me know if you can see my screen. If you can tell me if it works. Yes. So great, thank you, Ilaria. Saccani, thank you, Dominic Maria Scalone for the introduction. And now I also would like to thank Mrs. Alessandra Tibiletti, and she's following us, of course. So please, Alessandra, if you feel to add some details, feel free to act and intervene. We wanted to focus on the skin of the city because this is the aim of Capo's project, a wide experience that you already know, you already saw the partners, and we wanted to carry out an in-depth work on mural painting that must be included in a wide context of different art expressions referred to as urban art in relation to place rather than to their typology. In order to describe this pathway, I worked with Clara Amodeo and Mrs. Salamolo, so thank to both of them, and I tried to explain it in the best way possible, with the, of course, limit of copyright, so maybe you will not see specific images of what I will tell about, but you will find all these materials, I think, and you can follow me anyway, even if I did not include all the pictures, all the images, and then of course that I tagged. Capus worked in particular in Milan and Reggio Emilia in a research project that started with a dialogue with contemporary artists. We discussed about materials, their work, the type of deterioration, and with the chemical experts of Cesma Sette and conservators in particular, we talked about the need for new products for conservation and restoration methods. So Alessandro and I today would like to share with you the different conservation methods, because it's clear that the first project, the main focus of this work is to protect wall paintings in the cities. And it can be considered as a contradiction because the mural painting is almost everywhere. There could be public toilets or subways, and of course they are walls, but they consider the entire urban body. Of course, this requires a multidisciplinary approach, and this can be included only in the place where you find this expression of art, because this place, and we will see it later, we will try and understand the evolution of this process, of this phenomenon, and the place plays a fundamental role. We talk about cities, surfaces. So it's an intrinsic context. So when we talk about conservation, we have to think about it within specific contexts, where we have to keep unaltered the original quality of the study. And then the musealization of the image alone, or digital preservation, can be considered as an alternative. To understand these differences, we wanted to find some historic context for the street art, and I always repeat the fact that there is not an evolution line or an artistic process developed based on just one direction. It's later on that you understand, when you look back, and then you understand, and then you can understand the contemporary phenomena. And of course, all the historical roots must be studied, analyzed of course, in an open way. They create some conditions and some situations that can be useful to better interpret the current situation. For example, in the street artist case, and this is one of the main objects of this speech, everything turns around actions that are developed as the fact of affirming groups and the identities of groups in relation to the predominant culture. So if it is pretty common to mention the first forms of wall paintings, like in the French caves in Lascaux or Cueva de las Manos in Argentina, Santa Cruz, it is clear that everything can be related to the origin, of course. But when I was saying that it's easier to recognize things in a second guessing or in retrospect, and here you see the technique that is similar to the color spraying, because you can leave this signs, and of course we are talking about a reference dating back to 17,000 years ago, or we are talking about a reference that was recognized at the end of the 19th century, based on when we want to date the discovery of this caves. And so it's a different thing, it was not possible to do it like Vasaris wanted to do. We needed to create a context based on what we have and based on the phenomenon that we are studying. So I refer to Milan, Reggio Emilia, so our own context, our own reality. And in this context, we are trying to understand what is the main substance of mural painting that is today very important, because we talk about conservation. Why? Because we recognize to the mural painting today regeneration capability. We see it, and the public administrations to see it as a potential requalification method for different urban spaces. So it's thanks to this change in role that we recognize in wall painting a cultural heritage that we have to protect. And it is difficult to conceive, to read, and to propose when it happens, in this very moment. It's easier to recognize its importance when we look back at the history or in retrospect. Here you see some writing inscriptions dating back to the Pompeian ages. And when we talk about wall paintings in Italy, we do it in a country where the decoration of a public space for decoration or celebration, it's something recurring. It's part of the most noble tradition, and it belongs to the common areas of Italian cities, a very ancient tradition, because there was a need to communicate in the public and urban space, because it's where populations were gathered. For example, in the imperial age of at Roman times, you see different plaques, different writings and inscriptions. There are, for example, political inscriptions or monuments, and even the cities of the Roman Empire between the first and third centuries were characterized by these inscriptions in public spaces, and inscriptions were everywhere, and they were located on walls, in squares, in buildings, on buildings. And for sure, when there was, of course, the possibility to use the white walls on buildings, and so it was like an invitation to write a communication on there. So you see these images taken from Armando Petrucci's essay. So here we have an example of this tradition that was even further developed, and with the same criterion of that time, it conveys a message, having different ways of accessing. So it's a message addressed to different people, to different social classes, and so in this the architect Brenna, but of course it has a long origin, long-term origin. When we talked about Bisbandero, it's a way and a place that in which we live. So this is it's an inner urban internal contact. That's why we talk about images and the skin of the city. So I was saying, you have spaces characterized by writings and inscriptions. You have it in Salerno, in Pisa, or even in the specific place for art history. This is the famous inscription indicating the date, the foundation date of the cathedral in Modena. And you see here you have a date and you have a name. So an inscription can turn into a date and a name as well. And then we can have many more examples even in the Renaissance, or we can even go back to Pompeii. And of course, the creation of the more educated people. This includes also the creation of the promotional writing, and as we can see, or the political or the propaganda, the political writing. So it's you have overlapping, sometimes erasing, or sometimes even deface and deteriorate the wall. So here you see these are pictures that I took in Varese, in Sacromonte. They, of course, do not help the protection conservation of an artifact, but they are considered as programs, and they deny, they deeply change what was proposed by the political power. Or so we should always understand the anthropological reason that is behind the social structure that, of course, generate these urgencies by groups and people that with antagonist intentions. They, of course, want to stress some malaise situations, and even just to be remembered. Sometimes writings are rooted in personal intentions. They want to stress their presence, of course, despite the conservation of this art heritage. But when we want to restore this type of surfaces, we, of course, have to stop and ask questions, because you have the Milesian writings in the Palazzo del Tè in Mantua in the 17th century. They are all kind of witnesses that we have to register, we have to record, and we have to record as a sociological, anthropological phenomenon, because they, in a way, they are part of the history. You know, they just witness the presence of people in some places, and they are considered as historical documents. And so maybe digital conservation can allow us to make a different way of considering the original artifact and the original cultural asset. So ancient graffitis, or the writings of all the centuries, they find in the urban space a more specific context, in order to stress the importance of being there, in order to stratify the different information. Here you have some pictures taken in Berlin by Ziller, but also some Italian pictures. This is the title is bankruptcy because this is a shop that has been closed. Here you have we can read it as a blackboard in an artistical way, but for sure this is a layering of a different urgency or malaise. In Balushek works, we find in details, we are in the Berlin area, but we also saw other examples. Here you find this modern nature, the sharing of an urban space that is divided between several urgencies of trade, information, communication, and the freedom of expression. And so muralism shall be considered as a specific phenomenon, street art as well, that is developed between two urgencies, between power and creation. This is another work, Collezione Boschi di Stefano. I'm director of this museum. This is the Paesaggio di città, urban landscape. That's the title by Renato Birolli. You see the division, you see a garden and a street, and they can be considered as a surface where you can apply posters or the Age pictures. And these are considered as temporary hints of places that are under transformation. And then you see this book, title of which is Graffiti, and Bresset started to take pictures of materials that was interested, and in particular it focuses on the skin of cities, and that is to say the recording of this graffiti which marks the interest of the city and that are common to all avant-gardes. For example, as for the term graffiti, that was always referring to the engraving on our surface. And there were, of course, the signs, in the ancient populations, while the second half of the 20th century, it is used in a different way, this word. It appears on New York walls, and it finds a technical relation in this moment in time. But it also finds a shared motivation. If the term graffitism represents all the spontaneous signs born illegally, and from this term you have this poetry of street art as an elaboration of an articulated lettering, shaping, for example, colorful markers or spray cans. A different thing is writing, which referred to the movement born in the United States and arrived in Europe later on. So I would like to stress the difference between these two terms, but in this speech I also would like to refer to street art and all those artistic expressions, ephemeral or not, which in the 80s and 90s have progressively moved away from a virtuoso study of letters towards a figurative representation on specific moral works of art of specific sizes. Here again, you see some city urban pictures and then the nice engravings and the passage to the mural painting, which requires first moment of historical characterization. And to art historians, when you talk about muralism, you immediately think about Mario Cironi books devoted to the mural painting, but on the other side, because it's linked to the Mexican Revolution of 1910, the works of the Mexican muralism, Clemente Orozco, Diego Rivera e Davide Alfero Siqueiros. So, of course, we are assuming that there is a tie, a connection between the mural painting with a solid theoretical basis in the 30s to the phenomenon we are studying today. But of course, rediscovering the production of public art is not new. We said it already, because Italian cities were developed on public art, on some huge frescoing campaigns, and the Mexican muralists realized it, and when they talked about their revolutionary movement, and they communicated it on the walls of the cities. First, to support the revolution role of their movement, and then to celebrate the results of the revolution. And of course, you see that these huge form of art goes back to this ancient know-how. Leonardo, Michelangelo, all these artists, they are, of course, the vectors of the European cultures which were taken there, and all the travels of these Mexican people that they had in Europe. And here you can see some strong bonds, for example, in painting by Roberto Montenegro, Fiesta della Santa Cruz. You see that there is a reference to the public building in Siena, or here you have the chapel of the University of Chapingo, and this is a painting by Diego Rivera. Here again you have main topics like Mexican history, or the need for an identity, the need for Mexico to have an identity in art, supporting the voices of the Mexican populations. How can you do it? Of course, you can do it by studying the classical artists, for example, the mosaics in Ravenna or the Cappella Sistina, or the Italian works of art that were symbolic for our history. Here you see a fresco representing the history of the construction of a city, and it also mentions a method that is shared even when talking about construction sites. So there is an election, but from a political point of view, they are very different. In the biography of Margherita Salfati, for example, it is said that Mussolini hoped that Mexicans came to Italy to teach us and to share their method of public painting. But in reality, in Italy, all the big intellectuals and big intellectual experts spread out this phenomenon. For example, Sironi in the 30s gave to this type of painting the same value from a social point of view. But of course, it accompanied the political power that they were supporting. So, for example, the manifesto that was written in 32 and then published in 33, and that was signed by Sironi and Carrà, Funi and Campigli. And this manifesto explained this new season, going out from the limits of easel, because the easel, so the traditional painting, could not support the revolution. And then here you see different images of the construction of cities. And in Milan, we know it pretty well, even in relation to the futurism. Here you see that there is a programmatic declaration, and then they stress the need to go back to mural painting in order to get back to this conception of the new Italy. So you see, you have Sironi's moralism that is aimed at the use of painting in order to recompose the population's identity. It is made during the Fifth Triennale in Milan, because in a temporary way the most important artists of the Italian painting decided to paint on walls. And so this represents a deep change in mural painting. You change in size, but also in materials, in effectiveness of the shape that must be adapted to modified spaces. You also see the need for new techniques, and during this Triennale they also discuss about new technical difficulties requiring new solutions. So on the one side there is a distinction of mural painting for public spaces, for public buildings, and on the other side the novelty relating to the research for new materials, for new expression methods, that can give back to art. And this is a Severini talking. To give back to art, its its great role in history, because it's not only a tool and an instrument, and when it's not just by itself, it acquires a wider meaning. And here we see some examples of works, and we see how the relation between different plastic arts is manifold. You see the bas-relief, we see the use of public spaces, of course. These are useful public spaces. We saw two Sironi's frescoes that were recently taken back to the central postal office in Bergamo after being restored, and so these two works were taken back to their original place in history. And so Capus focused on the relationship between the work and its context. So the assumption of Cirone's art and the Mexican muralists, you see, you have some similar needs. There is a need for communication, wider communication, and to give figurative predominance to what you are doing. So this new Renaissance becomes prophetic and becomes a renaissance also of materials, of new materials. Here I included this image to show you how this can be considered as a final destination, you know, of this culture, because of course you won't find this writing any longer on the Rome University. So going back to the Triennale in 1933, the difficulty, of course, the difficulty concerned all those artists working with the large sizes, in particular Siqueiros, and with Rivera and Orozco, they moved to the United States, where they had to deal with strong issues. And in the United States, of course, they have to deal with this great public experience, but also private commission. And so they live this dichotomy that we can still find today in front of this expression need on these big sizes. And these muralist manifestos in the United States were cancelled due to what they contained, to what they depicted, or because they depicted political figures that were not conceived as appropriate any longer in the US history. So we, with these works, we can have strong positions and contrasting positions between the muralists on the one side and the public or private clients. And then I was referring to these new technical needs, you know, materials that needed to dry faster, and then maybe the use of synthetic polymers, and in particular it will lead into laboratories that Siqueiros will open in the United States. At that time, a lab to study the modern technical innovations. And here you see that to these labs you have big artists working like Jackson Pollock, and then you have the different use of industrial panels, or you see that there is I do not want to stress these evolution lines, as I said before, but it's clear that these experiments of muralism are really important, and they were recognized everywhere in the world. So they were considered in several countries where art art can be used as a literacy method, and I'm, for example, thinking about Chile, but they also embarked in the United States, and with Jackson Pollock, it arrives to the Biennale in Venice, so this art arrived in Italy as well. But it's important to stress the fact that this graffiti phenomenon, born in cities over the 60s, arrived later on. We needed more experiences, and I would like to talk about painted villages. Painted villages, it's an important Italian experience. Here you see artists working with the students of the Accademia di Brera, and then other cities, other villages like Dozza. There are several villages where this form of expression crosses the community, and it becomes the identity of municipal institutions. But when we talk about street artists, this piece of history is not enough. We have to look for other experiences, and in particular the border experiences, because you can innovate when you reach the border, and you can discover this phenomenon of graffitism, which will arrive in Italy later on, while, for example, the mural painting of Chile artists will arrive sooner. So going back to our collective movements and movements after 1968, we see that there are several significant experiences of a culture that is not antagonist. I mean, it's a research and experience-based situation and condition. Here we have these events related to the Nouveau Realism in Milan, 1970. Cristo, you see, enveloped a monument in Piazza Duomo, but it was the cause of different movements, antagonist movements. So provocative movement, and they were conceived not to last over time. And then we have other experiences supported by public administrations. Here with we have the experience of Volterra 73 and other works of different relevance. This wonderful work by Carrino that we will see in the Opera Ticinese, and other works that move away from that line that we depicted, both in formal aesthetic terms and in content, in their content, or not maybe their content, but for sure their formal aspect. Here you see this work, and Enrico Crispolti says you can hardly forget that these works were created in the Milan of the recent years, where you had public and political violent or riots, the Milan of the different state massacres or riots, or in this context of strategy of terror. So, what is the common element of these experiences? That these experiences, by the use of creativity, they want to stress the need for a further reflection, a further thought. Cristaldi always says the victim is the democratic human being, the democratic man and woman that is killed in Piazza Fontana, or maybe is committing suicide because not protected by the law. So it could be easy to move from Commedia to these Chile muralists. When they come to Italy with their expression mode, they export such language. But of course, the 68 movement left remarkable signs in art at all expressive levels, with all the artists we mentioned. And so the language becomes maybe abstract and becomes different, but the antagonist, the strong reason is the same. And then we have the experiences of the 70s that we mentioned, or Freedom for Chile that was installed in Campo San Polo, or we have in 76 the Biennale with De Micheli, expressing such request, and Micheli inviting this artist in Florence. But then we see this antagonist culture of this important Milan groups, in particular the Collettivo Autonomo of painters in Porta Ticinese. This is the leaflet showing this mural art that until a few years ago was visible in Milan, and the interest for this collective movement and for their actions. And I would like to call them actions. I refer to them as actions because they are street-based actions. For example, showing the Pablo Neruda Brigade or the Chile exhibition. They find their space and voice, and other expressions of culture, the graphic culture, or the culture of a political report. And here we can see in these student movements and riots this raison d'être that we find again in these villages in Sardinia. And you can see how the linguistic confrontation can be convincing and really effective. So pluralism of languages, high culture, high form of cultures, so this extemporaneity of this movement that are welcomed in Milan. and they are supported by the metropolitan graphitism as a way of diffusing an antagonist thought. They find an origin very far away with Ugo Volli. If I think about the student revolutions, I think about the different Chinese expressions, not just because they give voice to some political representatives, or they, in a way, communicate the different confrontation, the different battles between communists and fascists, but because they stress the importance of revolutionary methods, mass revolutionary methods, and the message becomes the medium. And I think that this quotation should be related, is very important, and should refer to the current use of social media. For example, here you see how the hegemony of the advertising companies is taking importance, the definition of letters, the multidisciplinary opening, supported by cultural experiences. This is the pollution experience led by Gianni Sassi, or other artistic experiences where this dialogue clash between antagonist movements, give way to a change, a reuse in writing. But of course, the true American muralism is in particular stressed by and evidenced by the Keith Haring in cooperation with Fiorucci. The house in Via Laghetto, and this painting is attributed to him, but of course it's the season of the recognition of the American street art. For example, the Francesca Linovi's exhibition in 1983, organized the Arte di Frontiera. They stressed the importance of this expressive method that is gaining more and more importance. And here differences become significant differences, because on the one side we have the street art, so large walls, the tradition from dripping to Pollock, and that led the way and that brought to the need for positions on the urban walls, and on the other side the pathway of street art, which remains more close to the American style, which is linked to this metropolitan language. And so it goes back to subways and trains years later, but with this dichotomy, which is not generated by a simple issue, but on the contrary by huge macro topics, like how the street art is received and considered. If we, for example, consider the different exhibitions in Turin at the end of the 90s, on the exhibition in Venice in 2007, in many other exhibitions, but the situation is still not very clear. Until a few years ago, outside the parameters where large wall surfaces were allowed, wall painting in many areas is still forbidden, because the question asked by Del Lago Giordano is who is the owner of the city, and we still have to provide an answer to this question. And here you see two examples. The famous murals Hope supporting Obama during his electoral campaign, and the artist was even thanked by Obama for what he did for his art expression. On the other side, we have to remind that New York mayor spent a lot of money for many years to stop muralism and to stop graffitism. So when you always have, for example, this relation with hip hop or rap culture, so the music, it is clear that the starting topic remains a fundamental one. So we have situation of degradation where it is necessary to state in a different way, to state something in a different way. It could be a way of improving situations, or it could be just a way of proving your presence. So the different normalization processes, sticker art, stencil art, poster art, they of course led to huge developments, but also to be taken to studios. This is an historical picture, just to say who is going to decide what's art or not, what we need to preserve or not. And ourselves as public, as citizens, are we going to appreciate the writing on doors on the street, or are we going to see it as a defacing situation or degraded situation? How can we impede, how we can stop these street artists? So how can be licit and can be legitimate to impede this form of expression? So once again we have all the paradigms concerning street art, and for example we have the case where the short circuit of all the different rooms, even starting from the same objective principles. So you see the municipal institutions asking for works to this artist, and with this benefits and advantages even for the toponymy, because the murals allow you to immediately meet this popular need for toponymy. It's like a celebration poster. It represents immediately the face of a hero, of a victim, of a person. and toponymy needs 10 years before assigning and naming a street to somebody, while the mural art can do this. And so in 2007, the exhibition Street Art, Alessandro Riva followed another pathway. Looking for Lo Savio operations or Bros interventions based on this dual aspect of toponymy and images. You see the redundance of public images in the city centers has a dual layer. It becomes advertising, and advertising embraces all linguistic forms, even the most revolutionary ones, even the most innovative ones, and the advertising can absorb all this. But there are other experiences as a proposition, and proactive. This is Ortica Noodle's painting during the lockdown in 2020, and you see the representation of the museum, the representation of a sculpture of Francesco Messina. So the street art became the vehicle of the traditional art into the street, therefore repeating its potential of arts made by artists. In particular, these artists are young and they have the necessary school preparation, and you see use and abuse of different forms of art and then this is the exhibition JR La Ferita in Florence. Mettere in mostra questa gigantesca anamorfosi che mi piace condividere con voi proprio perché va a recuperare quella grande. So here you see the tradition of the Italian cities. This is palinsesto, you know, the work you see here in Florence, and you see even on the Catalan's finger, and the Catalan reaction is interesting because it's an artist working on an artist, but we wondered if it was legal or not legal, and these are some other actions led in Milan where we see the layering of different actions. This is a workshop with the young students of the academia, and here you can recover ancient experiences. You see young people bringing around the city with different contents, but not with different instances, the same communication tools that we saw before in the collective movement. And I would like to conclude with a thought to Chop e Calf, street art from Naples, and they come in the museum with a set of sculptures because they say that probably they decided to stop painting, or not to stop painting at all, but to answer to the question why. I'd rather not answer as Bartleby by trying to remove this dualism, slave and master, or famous or poor. And they taught us that you have to refuse this dualism, and I don't know how, so I feel powerless. I wanted to continue as I started to do between Naples and Taranto, but it was an on-site research, and I was trying to use painting and presence, the oral history, and the absence of judgment, because I cannot continue like before, because this public art was digested and neutralized by making it impossible any attempt to be on the side of this telling, putting everything in just one container. And I would like to mention Voltaire, and I'm asking you if what is the future today of the street art, or if there is the risk of Voltaire's wizards that they stop existing exactly in the very moment when we stop burning them. Thank you very much.
Grazie Maria per questo
Thank you, Maria, for this speech, and thanks to Alessandra Tibiletti, who is a co-author.
Per quanto riguarda le domande, vi ricordo che
as for questions, I would like to remind you that you have the specific chat question and answers where you can ask questions, and please also name the name of the speakers, and then we will ask these questions to the speakers in the specific session. We are running late, so I cannot show you the presentation I showed before, but you will receive the same information at the end of the day. So before leaving the floor to Clara Amodeo, we stop 10 minutes. So until 10:30, and then we will start again with Clara Amodeo. So see you in 10 minutes. Thank you.
Eccoci di nuovo e ben ritrovati per questa seconda.
Welcome back to this second part of the session. Now we give the floor to Clara Amodeo. And she has a degree in Sciences of Cultural Heritage to the University of Study Milan. She attended the School for Journalism, and she also, since 2018, is the president of the Cultural Association around the Scratch in the Wall, and she opened this blog in 2014 in the School of Journalism, and so we are very happy to have her here, and she can really tell us something interesting, and she worked with us in a very fruitful way. So thank you, Clara. Thank you, Ilaria. Good
Il mio
morning.
intervento oggi verterà sul tema
Today I
dell'urban
will
art
talk
in
about
un
urban
intervento
art.
intitolato L'urban
And
art
the
tra
title I
spontaneità
chose
e
is
tutto il
Urban
resto.
Art Between Spontaneity and
Condivido
Everything
quindi
Else. I'll try and share my
questa
presentation
parte
with
di
you,
presentazione e inizio
and then
con
I
il
start.
mio intervento. Quando si
When
analizza in maniera
analyzing
generica
in a
e
generic
leggermente
and of course
generalizzante
generalizing
l'urban
way
art,
the urban
è
art,
condizione
it
necessaria
is
partire dalla
necessary to
sua
start from
primigenea
its
forma,
primigenial
quella cioè
form,
spontanea.
the
Si
spontaneous
tratta di
one.
un vero e proprio
It is a real
motore senza il quale
engine
nulla
without
di
which
quanto vediamo
nothing
oggi
of
nelle
what we
nostre
see
città
today in our
potrebbe
cities could
effettivamente
exist.
esistere. La spontaneità
Spontaneity
sta
is in
infatti alla
fact the
base del
basis of writing
writing
or
o graffiti
graffiti
writing,
writing,
che dalla
that from the
taglia alla
tag to
sua
its
elaborazione più
most
complessa,
complex elaboration, represented
rappresentata dal
by
wild
wild
style,
style,
ha posto le
has
basi
laid
perché una
the
cultura
groundwork
underground,
for an
dedita
underground
tanto
culture
all'azione
dedicated
quanto
as
alla
much to the
retratezza,
action as to
ma
the
poco al
aesthetics, but
contenuto,
little to the
potesse
content.
imporsi sulla
It could
graduale
impose itself on the
spersonalizzazione delle grandi
gradual
città di tutto il mondo,
depersonalization of big
grazie
cities
all'uso di
around the
una
world through the
semplice
use of a
bomboletta
simple spray
spray.
can.
Spontanea è anche la prima
Spontaneous is
street
also the
art
first
che
street art
condiviene un
with
marcata mente
a
politico
more
e
marked
sociale rispetto al
political and
writing,
social
ha
intent
saputo
than
divulgare
writing has
attraverso
been
mezzi
able
ben
to
più
spread
disparati
out
messaggi carichi di contenuto
messages
e
loaded with
soprattutto in maniera
content and
leggibile,
above all in a
imponendo
readable way,
sentite
thus
direzioni
placing itself in a
divergenti rispetto ai
divergent direction
graffiti,
from
pur
graffiti, even
ovviamente nascendo
if
nel loro
it
solco
was born in
circa
their
30 anni
wake
dopo.
after
Infine,
30
anche
years.
il muralismo urbano
And then the
contemporaneo, nella sua
contemporary
iniziale
urban
veste
muralism, in
spontanea,
its
ha saputo
initial
trasporre i temi della
spontaneous
street art, ma
form,
anche
has
del
been able
graffiti, su superfici di
to transpose to
grandissime
the themes of street
dimensioni,
art, but also of
per
graffiti,
una
on
fruizione
very
totale
large
sui
surfaces
potenziali
for a
o nelle
total
deformazioni al
fruition,
massimo dell'adrenalina.
as well as for an
Quando si parla di
action at
spontaneità,
maximum
tuttavia,
adrenaline.
l'agire del tempo e
When
di
we
alcune
talk about
cause di
spontaneity,
forza maggiore
however,
che trovano
the action of
grande
time and
consenso
of
oltre che
some force
legittimazione nello
majeure
spazio pubblico,
reshape and
rimodulano
change
e
this
cambiano
feeling
tale sentimento
until
fino
sometimes
talvolta
to
ad affievolirlo,
weaken it or
perché
even
no, se
turn
non
it off.
spegnerlo.
And this
Questo
happens
accade perché
because
le
there
forze
are
in gioco
two
sono
forces
principalmente
at
due,
play
con
with
intenti finalità
such
quasi
divergent
emergenti,
intentions
quasi da
that they
toccarsi
touch
talvolta.
each
Da
other.
una parte
On
infatti
the
ci sono
one
le
hand, you
istituzioni,
find
le quali, specie
institutions,
nelle
which
grandi città,
especially
hanno
in
sì
large
viaggiato una vera e
cities
propria
have both
lotta a
engaged
questo tipo di
in a real
espressione,
fight
sia
against
in
this
tempi poco
type
più
of
recenti
expression,
iniziato un
and in
graduale
more recent
avvicinamento
times
al
began
movimento,
a
che in alcuni
close
casi si è
up with
tradotto
the
in
movement.
dialogo,
In
ma
some
che in molti
cases,
altri non
it
è stato altro
led
che
to a
una sorta di
dialogue. In other
corteggiamento,
ways,
oserei
in other
profetiamo, poi
forms, it was
fuorviato
a
che
real
sapesse
courtship, a
riqualificare,
flattering one, I would add,
rigenerare
to any
aree,
form of art
quartieri,
that could
situazioni a cui
requalify
la
or
politica non è
regenerate
mai
areas,
stata veramente in
neighborhoods,
grado di mettere mano,
situation that
apponendo quindi
politics
una
has
sorta
never
di
been able to
pecetta
put their hands
colorata
on,
su
thus
ferite
putting a sort
ben
of
più
color
profonde.
flap on
Un
much
atteggiamento
deeper
davvero
wounds.
pericoloso
So, a
che nel tempo ha
dangerous
mostrato il suo
attitude
volto
that
più
over time
schizofrenico
has
con
shown its
risultati tragici
most
sotto gli occhi di tutti.
schizophrenic face,
Infatti, mentre offre proprio
while
patrocinio oneroso
offering
agli
its
interventi di qualificanza,
partnership or
che abbiamo
patronage
visto, o
to the
svende muri a
redevelopment
tempo
interventions
e
mentioned
talvolta
above, or
sottopagano gli
even
artisti per dipingere il proprio
worse,
logo,
they
la
sell off
pubblica
to
amministrazione si
the walls to
costituisce anche
brands that
parte
underpay
civile nei processi
artists to
agli
paint their
artisti che
logos.
operano ancora
And
spontaneamente,
the
accusati
public
del reato di
administration is a
imbrattamento
civil
perché
party in the trial
sottoposti
of artists who
all'attività
still operate
disciplinare.
spontaneously, accused of
Dall'altra
crime
parte
of
ci sono gli
defacement,
artisti
and
che
then
sono
subjected to
o
criminal
vittime
activities.
di quanto
On the other
sopra,
hand,
ma che hanno
you have
comunque
the
goduto, che
artists,
sono comunque goduti
victims of the
scendere a
above,
compromessi
and they
in un
had to
mondo
compromise with a
inevitabilmente
word
normato
inevitably
ed entrare a
normalized
logiche
and enter
logiche
into
esterne a quella della spontaneità
logics
per rendere la
external
propria
to those of
passione un vero e
spontaneity,
proprio
to make their
lavoro.
passion a
Un
real
passaggio di
job.
certo non
This
facile,
was not
che
an
nel
easy
tempo portato a
transition, which
scontri e
over time
frazioni
led to
interne e di
clashes and
certo non ha
internal
aiutato il
fractures
movimento a rimanere
that
unito.
certainly did
C'è
not
questo è anche
help the
uno dei
movement
motivi
to
per cui
remain
oggi quello
united.
dell'arte urbana è un
That's
magma fluido
why
per
today
ragioni
urban
legate
art
proprio a
is
queste
considered as a
tematiche.
fluid
Quindi,
magma
quello che
still
negli ultimi 50 anni,
ongoing.
sia dalla nascita
So,
del
over the
writing a
last
New
50
York, si sta
years,
sempre più
since the
marcatamente
birth of
delineando
writing in
nel
New
mondo
York has
dell'arte
been
urbana,
increasingly
è una
emerging in the
situazione
world of urban
stratificata
art,
in
and
cui
it
convivono non
represents a
senza
stratified situation in which three approaches to the spontaneity of movement coexist. The first is that of pure quintessential spontaneity. The resulting work still links to the world of writing, but also to the first street art and the first contemporary urban muralism, are in some cities such as Naples still alive and active, not only on buildings but also on trains and subways, while in others such as Milan they are slowly subjected to a normalization process with different names. First of all, free walls of vademecum. This is an activity left to the free management not only of the individual artist who pays for the materials out of his own pocket, or in the absence of free walls still puts his personal freedom at risk, but also of the community itself, able to self-regulate from within long before institutional procedures existed. Stylistically, they are the most lively and spontaneous representation of the movement itself, and when you want to start approaching the subject through the examples of those who are recognized as true kings, so representative ones. The image that I chose for explanatory purposes and not on the basis of a selection of the authors who made it, it's the first and purest example of the absolutely spontaneous form in antithesis with the institution of writing. It is a whole car, so the covering of an entire train carriage with letters and numbers of enormous sizes, and you see polychromatic colors. Made entirely with the use of spray cans and in all likelihood by several members of two crews. You see the names 031 and BK on the right. The intervention is spontaneous and illegal because it clashes with the rules related to public decorum and the preservation of tangible and intangible assets of the city. This is how historically in Bronx and Harlem in New York, graffiti writing was born, in the wake of which street art, contemporary urban muralism were later generated, and without which nothing of what we see today in our cities could exist. So the intent of this intervention is to imprint one's name of the crew on different supports. Crossing the city can shout in this way to the public, I exist and this is my name. So, speaking of New York, what over time has been recognized as the Mecca of graffiti could only arise in the city that gave birth to the movement, and more precisely in Queens. Here you see the building known as 5 Points. In this case, is a set of spontaneous interventions from 1993 and 2013 have gone to legally cover the walls of a private building at the intersection of 5 boroughs in New York, and it became a coveted stop. And you see, beyond the reading of the individual works, over time have been piled up on top of each other, although the place enjoyed a sort of artistic direction perpetrated by the writer Maris, who however was not the owner of the building. It is interesting to make a historical and legal reference to the fate of the building to understand its cultural importance. On the night between November 18 and 19, 2013, the owners of the building, brothers Jerry and David Wolkoff, not only whitewashed the entire building and they deleted all the works that were made, but a few days later they also demolished the building, thus losing a cultural memory of 10 years. However, 4 years after the demolition, which took place in 2014, a federal judge in Brooklyn ordered the property to pay $6.7 million to 21 21 artists who had turned themselves in as plaintiffs for the murals erased at 5 points. And this judgment was defined as historic because it says that the building had become a major tourist attraction, and therefore graffiti is art to all intents and purposes, therefore protected by US law. Going back to this layering approach, the second approach concerns sponsorship or commission, be it public or in collaboration with profit entities. They are related both to the world of graffiti and to the world of street art. But while in the first case we speak of sponsorship through partners that are in fact often technical brands, and they support the so-called jams, events, and they do not cause interference from the point of view of content. Well, the second case has to do with public or civic commission through the help of entities that not technical. They pay in part the operation, but ask that the work has some relevance to the cause that the reality support, and insert themselves in the territory through the project in line with the same. So this, of course, had a positive impact, in particular on the entire neighborhood and on the perception the inhabitants have of it. The work made in 2014 on commission of the section Niguarda of Ampi on a wall owned by the city of Milan was created by one of the longest lived and militant Milanese collectives, Volks Writers. This name was used first in 2000 during a wall organized on the Darsena in the Naviglio in Milan to request the release of some anti-fascist militants arrested following clashes in Piazzale Loreto with militants of the extreme right. To give a life to Volks Writers, initially two writers already active on the Milanese scene, Soviet and Morcone, who having German roots decided to opt for this Teutonic name. Volks Writers immediately distinguished themselves for their militant attitude, and they start organizing events in Milan in particularly representative places, in social centers and occupied spaces. In May 2001, they organized the first self-managed street art jam around the Deposito Bulk, the social center, and around Soviet and Morcone, the circle of artists who joined the Volkswriters widened up, and it includes now Osmo 2501 and Mban, until forming what can be considered as the original nucleus of VW. They represent an example of militant painting, but open to the contribution of those writers who want to actively participate in collective artistic moments. The choice of the location is not random, since it is a very site-specific work. On the blood red background that fades into yellow tones, you see there are capital letters. You probably do not see them, but they form the word Niguarda Antifascista. You see the red outlines on this. On the left, there are two women on bikes, Gina Galeotti Bianchi and Stellina Vecchio, both young members of the communist parties. They were relay girls during the resistance, and on April 24th, 1945, riding their bikes, they were carrying the order to the workers of the factories in northern Milan to authorize the insurrection, the general strike. But where today we have the Ospedale Maggiore, on that day they run into a German truck with Wehrmacht soldiers. fleeing from a platoon of partisans, and you see it on the right of the work. So from the truck, some shot started, and so Stellina remains unharmed, while Gina dies a few minutes later, and she was 30 years old, 6 months pregnant, with a husband in prison at San Vittore as opponent of the regime. So this work is now a real landmark of the area and a tribute, and Niguarda district celebrates the liberation a day earlier than the rest of Italy. In March 2016, the Committee for the Foresta dei Giusti and Garu Onlus and the City Council Paola Bocci hired different artists, Pau, Ivano, Ticanudos and Piger, to paint on a wall of a building owned by the city of Milan, the Fabbrica del Vapore, a tribute to Khaled al-Assad, the Syrian archaeologist executed in 2015 by ISIS militiamen for refusing to hand over to them the precious artifacts hidden in the site of Palmyra, just conquered by the terrorists. While the archaeologist's portrait is by Ticanudos, the floral and landscape decoration are by Pau. Calligraphy is both by Ivan in the thicker part and Piger. The same artist who wrote "To take a step forward is not to go away," the incipit of a beautiful lyric dedicated to Khaled al-Assad and composed by Ivan himself. The wall was inaugurated during the program of events organized for the European Day of the Writers, the Giusti. This last work that we see to understand the difference in terms of spontaneity was created by Razor Vezet Core 79 Wens CMD and Mr. Fyodor in Turin during the edition of Pic Turin 2011. The event, a real gem that over time has gathered in Turin thousands of writers, street artists and urban muralists, was born in 2010 as one of the main events of Torino 2010, the European Capital of Youth, funded by the Ministry of Youth and coordinated by several local associations as well as by the Fondazione Contrada Torino Onlus. The second edition of Pic Turin, programmed by youth policy sector within the activities included in the provincial local youth plan, was funded by the province of Turin and designed and managed by the association that we mentioned before. The example of the city of Turin is one of the most interesting in Italy for the long-standing and mutually beneficial dialogue between both parties, so the artistic community and public institutions. And I would like to conclude my speech with the third approach to spontaneity, and is probably the most distant one, and it concerns commercial works. They can be seen in streets or in cities in a different way. So you go from the most blatantly commercial work, which engages an artist for the sole purpose of having the artist painting a logo and starting from a pattern constructed in agreement with advertising marketing agencies, to the one in which, despite the payment of the work is borne by a private or a company, it provides for a total or partial omission of the logo to leave more or less space to the artist, who becomes a cultural mediator between the company, the client company, its history on the territory itself, and the community living there. While the first case is not only an interesting but also a demeaning approach to creativity and free expression, both of the artist and the street, in the second case, the artist must be able to understand the needs of the client, creating a work that is able to convey values that are both corporate and shared with a community to which always the work is addressed. And now I concluded my short speech. Thank you. Thank you, Clara, for this interesting speech, integrating the speech of Maria and Alessandra at the beginning, and of course, focusing on the works of the project. Now, we have the Q&A session. We have a question for Maria and Alessandra. And then you will see who is going to give the answer by an attendee, Mrs. Sonnino. In the speech of the different art expressions, in particular with the street art, the topic of conservation should be, in my opinion, strictly contextualized. Otherwise, it's difficult to consider the opportunity of the traditional action of conservation. What do you think about it? A really interesting question. The project, of course, focused a lot on this. And so now I ask this question to Maria and Alessandra. I can provide an answer to this lady. And of course, yes, this is one of the most important topics, and you have to contextualize it by knowing that a work cannot be separated from its environment, and by knowing that it is acquiring the role of cultural heritage. And so while acting, you have to plan an intervention gathering different roles and profiles, art historian, the chemical expert. So you have to conceive it in a different way, but you also have to conceive the work of art in a different way from the degradation point of view. You have to understand what you want to preserve or to restore. So you can therefore take a picture of the work and then preserving it, because you have to move from an ephemeral work of art to a work of art inside a process that has a meaning and that changes over time with the different work alteration, therefore changing its meaning. For example, the alteration of a work that we analyze, a work on Mandela, so the color change altered the meaning perception, because at the beginning the face of Mandela was represented with realistic colors, and therefore arising, an emotional impact that was direct. The alteration of colors, and we didn't know what was the original form, transformed this message into a stylish face, recalling the values conveyed by Mandela, not Mandela himself as a person. So we have to think about preserving a process, and to preserve a process, you have to think about the fact that a conservation intervention must use low-resistant products. So you have to follow this transformation process of the work and of its change in meaning, and you have to consider this. So why not carrying out a preventive intervention. This happens in contemporary art, so the relationship between artists and conservators. So let's decide beforehand what we want to do, what we can do. And this is the Capus project focus. So treating the wall not just in relation with its exposure, but also in relation to the traffic or to the sunlight exposure. So what I would like to stress is that direct interventions shall be carried out only if they are strictly necessary. And we talk about street art as a work in progress, and so which is spread out inside a process. Thank you.
Grazie. E aggiungerei anche che dall'intervento di Maria e di Alessandra
From Maria and Alessandra's speech, I think we perceive the importance of what comes beforehand. So the performing nature that is linked to the context. And Capus, our project focused on this in many aspects, so preserving this nature as well, when of course it is there and it is present, like for example shooting videos of the work or pictures of the material used and the implementation of the art, so that you can keep track of what was used for the creation of this performance, and to keep memory and keep track of all the elements related to the art, to the work of art. Another question.
Viene detto che per chi riterrà utile dare riscontro a quest'altra mia riflessione
So the street art is spontaneous, illegal, or the result of a client's request. If the principle of protecting its value is contextualized in an urban area, why not inserting in the conservation idea the concept of transformation? Therefore, supporting it with documents for the original memory, but also welcoming the potential transformation, even its degradation. So, because I think we have to welcome, so to say, and to even accept the fact of forgetting this art. And so accepting the oblivion. I'm convinced that what we are trying to understand and to know is to find evaluation tools that might be imperfect but still useful, focusing on the performance was to recognize the temporary character of these works, and they are not always made to be long-lasting. Even the artist, may decide to create them as temporary. And then you have similar phenomena, because after a while history becomes predominant, and then maybe can push it in protecting something that was not created to be protected. So we have to pay attention. We have to pay attention not to change the social temperature that you can measure on the skin of the city, and the temperature, the society temperature is not made up with the restoration of a mural or mural painting. So you have to act exactly as you would act in a museum. So there is a single piece that has its meaning, but you also have to preserve and to respect the context. And so you do not only have to think about walls, but you also have to think about actions. In particular, when we thought about the psychogeography or the situationism as an important hint. So there's something that maybe was not created to last, but that is the form of emotional confusion, no? The fact of they want to leave signs, to leave track, and to cross the city, because even that space belongs to you, even if you're told it's not yours. And so I think that the suggestion of this lady, of course, deserves a further reflection, and that is what Alessandra was saying. You first have to ask yourself what are the reasons behind a specific work that could represent a solution for the future. On the past, you have to understand what we can do.
Grazie mille, Maria.
Thank you, Maria.
C'è
There is
un'altra
another
domanda,
question.
io però prima
But
di passare all'ultima
before
domanda volevo
before asking this last question, I have a question for Clara.
dato che comunque tu hai il polso della situazione
You know what's going on in communities because you also organize guided tours. What is the relationship
del contesto, ma soprattutto
between the inhabitants and the artistic context as for conservation, and in which form? So thank you, Ilaria. I think it perfectly fits in what Alessandra Maria have just said. I think that discussing it with the artist is fundamental in your activity.
Scusatemi un attimo. E quindi
I'm sorry.
Quindi vi dicevo
So the
la parte di
contact with the artistic community is necessary. We talk about very young people, of course, and we can discuss with them in a very open way. So what is the relationship with the community? Well, I must say it's an ambiguous relationship, because it's an ephemeral translation, that of urban art, and it does not include the duration over time. The street artists know that their piece of art would be undergoing to the weather conditions, or other artists may be painting on top of what they depicted or what they painted. So the initial approach can be, I do not want you to work on this, let's keep away. So that's why I'm always stressing the importance of discussing with artists and street artists, because they are usually young, and once you explain them their goal of the conservation, then the approach towards the topic changes. And so the artist also can change his or her mind. So it's always necessary to have a conversation with the community. Thank you, Clara. Capus project right from the beginning wanted to have this methodological approach, and
mosso
And
da
everything
un
was
primo
moved,
dialogo
starting from a
con gli
first
artisti attraverso
chat with the
un'intervista
artists,
e un
with the
dialogo anche
interviews,
con il
and with
testo,
the context itself,
che sarà
which is
proprio
going to
oggetto
be
del prossimo
the
intervento
subject matter of a
dopo la pausa.
next
Volevo
speech after
semplicemente
the break.
mantenere
And then,
l'ultima
as for the last
domanda
question that
che
we
è
received,
arrivata, che ne è arrivata un'altra sullo stesso tema. Scusate, richiamo un attimo la domanda di prima. Elena Valentin dice quando un'immagine copre
when
un'altra
an
immagine
image
precedente
covers a
pubblicata
previous
più
image
importante
of
o di
a
un collega
well-known
noto,
artist,
si predilige
do you
togliere l'immagine
prefer to
secondaria di un
remove the
autore magari
secondary
ancora
image that
emergente o
maybe
no?
is not by a famous artist or
Sulla
not?
stessa
And
tematica,
on this,
Elisabetta
Elisabetta Bosetti
scusate,
asks,
chiede il fenomeno della sovrapposizione è
overlapping, this
abbastanza
phenomenon is
comune, è
pretty
stato riscontrato
common.
nella tua ricerca, questa è una
This
domanda
is for
diretta per
you,
Clara,
Clara.
è
Did
stato
you
riscontrato
find
nella
it
tua
in your
ricerca
research?
di
So
sovrapposizione in
overlapping,
senso
not
non di
in terms
in
of
senso
tag,
cambio,
but
ma
really
proprio di
overlapping
sovrapposizione. E
image.
qual è
What is the
l'approccio in termini
approach
di
in terms of
documentazione e
documentation and
conservazione?
conservation? This is
Quindi
really
il fenomeno
interesting.
della
So the
sovrapposizione
overlapping
perché è stata
phenomenon.
posta in senso di non superaffettazione o comunque scritta, ma in
So
senso
not
di
just in terms of
alta,
tags or
come
writing,
dire,
but
opera in
so
senso
two
continuo,
works
immagino.
overlapping, so
Quindi in
two
questo senso,
different works of
come si
art
muove
overlapping. So
la
what is
comunità
the
degli
approach
artisti?
of the artist,
La domanda
the arts
diretta a Clara.
community?
Ma allora, nella comunità non si fa
In
questo
the
tipo di
community,
distinzione. La
you do
copertura è
not
una
make
copertura,
such distinction.
sia essa
Covering
un
is a covering,
crossing, un
is a
tagging, un
crossing,
buffing.
tagging,
Un
buffing.
crossing
Crossing is when
quando
you
si applica
apply
una
a
croce,
cross,
il tagging
tagging
è
when
quando
you
si
apply
applica
a
la
tag,
firma, il
buffing
buffing è
is
quando
when you
si
cover with
copre
something
con
new.
qualcosa di nuovo. Ecco,
In
in
these
tutti questi
cases,
casi originariamente c'è il sentimento
of
di
course, there is
rivalità.
this feeling of
Quindi
rivalry.
l'approccio
And
alla
so the
copertura non è
approach to
mai
covering
positivo.
is not
Significa veramente cercare
positive.
lo
It
scontro,
means you
soprattutto
are
laddove
looking
c'è
for
spontaneità.
a
Nel
clash.
tempo poi ovviamente le cose sono cambiate,
Over
come adesso c'è
time,
stata
things
una
change,
normalizzazione,
and
se
there
vogliamo, una
is
cambio
even a
di
change in
approccio
this
a
in
questo
approach in
tema,
this
e
topic,
quindi
and
la
so
copertura è
covering
stata si è
did
modificata nel
change over
tempo. Prendo
time.
per esempio il caso dei
For
100 muri
example,
liberi del
100 muri
comune di
liberi
Milano.
in the
Sono
municipality of
100
Milan,
muri nati
so
da una delibera del
100
2015
walls
voluta dal comune di Milano,
recognized
con cui
by the
100 muri di proprietà
municipality
di
of Milan
FS, un miglio
and
di
property of
sì, insomma, FS delle
the
ferrovie o di
Italian
proprietà del comune
Railway
sono stati
or the
donati alla
municipality,
città.
they were
In quel caso
donated to the city.
chiunque può
So
andare a
on these
produrre
walls,
un'opera di arte urbana,
everyone
che essa
can
derivante dal mondo
go
del
there
writing, dello
and
street art, qualunque.
create a
Nei
work of
tempo è
art, and
assolutamente lecito e
over
riconosciuto
time
che ci sia continuo
it is
turnover. Ecco, quello
recognized and
che è stato fatto
accepted that there is a
precedentemente viene
continuous
coperto e
turnover of
completamente
art
rifatto da
expression. So
altri
new
artisti.
artists
Ora,
can cover
capite
a
bene che
previous
l'approccio è cambiato. Rimane
performance.
comunque un
So the
sentimento
approach was
originario che
different.
prevede
The
che
approach is
vada a
now
ricoprire
different, but of course there
qualcuno
is
che è
this
stato
feeling. I mean, if you are going
l'opera che è stata
there and you
realizzata
cover
precedentemente in qualche
a
modo si
previous
accordi con la
work, in
persona
a
che
way
l'ha
you
coperta.
should
Quindi comunque rimane questa,
contact the
diciamo, chiamiamola
artist
legge non scritta,
of
forse è un
the
po'
work you
brutto, un
want to
po'
cover.
brutale
So
chiamarla così, però
maybe
rimane
it's
questa cosa,
not
questo
something
comportamento,
in
questa
writing, but it's
legge non scritta
a
per cui
kind of
si cerca di evitare il più
verbal
possibile lo scontro.
law so
In
that
altri
you can
casi
avoid
invece, ma qui
any
parliamo di opere che
clash or
sono più
rivalry.
strettamente legate alla
In other
commissione,
cases, in case of
si è
a
cercato il
client,
dialogo. Mi viene in mente per esempio l'opera realizzata dagli
there is
Orticanudos
this need
in
for a
Isola,
dialogue. For example, the
dove
Ortica
Maria ha fatto
Noodles
vedere
work in
la
Isola,
recente
and
opera
Maria,
degli Orticanudos,
Maria
precedentemente
showed
era
the
stata fatta
recent
un'opera
work of Dica Noodles,
pubblicitaria
while before there was
dedicata ai
an
110 anni del
advertising work
Winter,
dedicated to
dove
the
era stata raffigurata la squadra di
110
Inter dall'11
years
febbraio
of the
2000.
AC
Nottetempo
Inter
qualcuno va
Milan, the
all'ingiornanza
football
delle
team,
nuove
and
colore
then
rosso sul muro, le quali supportano
overnight
l'opera, e
somebody
probabilmente a qualche
launched
milanista questo
red
potrebbe
eggs
interessare
on the
coinvolgere
wall,
la squadra
maybe
dell'Inter. Ebbene, in quel
some
caso gli
Milan supporters or the other local team. And so they decided to create a dialogue. So they added a writing. They did not erase this dripping, red dripping. They added the writing, respect has no color. So you see, there is this attitude of creating a dialogue. And in that case, there was a need for dialogue. The approach can be different. And so it depends on the type of art, if it's spontaneous or commissioned. And then there is another activity that is a political one. For example, Ni Guarda Antifascista, what we recently saw, was of course, were the object of continuous political covering and overlapping. Of course, in particular, in a specific period of time, people of the extreme right political party applied swastikas or different messages, of course, revolting messages on this work of art. But in this case, I think it's the community responsibility to preserve and to respect the work, because they have to, of course, protect the work from any insult. We received other questions, but we will deal with them later on. So now we stop for a break, a short break, which in particular for our interpreter, thank you on my behalf. So we'll see each other in 10 minutes with Grazia Cavanna and Alessandra Tibiletti's speech. Thank you.
Ben ritrovati dopo questa breve pausa.
Welcome back after this short break, and now we'll give the floor to the third speakers, Grazia Cavanna, Alessandra Tibiletti, methodological issues, artists, interviews, and dialogue with the context. They are both art historians and conservators, and they work in Milan. They are researchers for the Capus project as a component of and members of Cesmar 7. So to you the floor. Please, can you tell us if you can hear us and we can... okay, great. Yeah, you also see our presentation.
Allora, come precedentemente indicato,
as previously mentioned, our research in the Capus context dealt with contemporary muralism. So, works that were made in public space and that have their meaning within a specific context, converted into a place of artistic experience. Indeed, a work of urban art is a work in a social space where the material is one's own city, as indicated in the articles by Fernando Figueroa Saavedra and Elena Garcia Gallo. in the monographic of Arte Urbano, Conservación, 10, number 10 of 2016.
L'oggetto artistico dell'arte urbana
So the artistic
non si limita
object
a un
of the
prodotto
urban
fisico o
art is
un'immagine,
not limited
quanto
to
a
a
un
physical
processo
product
in un
or an
contesto
image,
dinamico
but it
sociale.
is related to a
E
process
un'opera di arte
in a
urbana
dynamic
non
context
è
and
pittura o
social context.
immagine,
And
è
a
prima
work
di
of art, an
tutto
urban work
lavoro
of
in un
art, is
contesto.
not, first
Il
of all, a
materiale è la
painting.
propria
It's,
città.
first of all, a work within a context. And the
Siamo
material
partiti
is the
dal
city.
dialogo strutturato
So
con
we
gli
started
artisti,
from the
che
conservation that
ringraziamo
we
per la
developed with the
disponibilità a
artist.
condividere
And
con
so
noi,
thank to them
esperienze
for
e
their
concezioni del proprio
availability,
lavoro,
and they shared with us experiences and the ideas behind their works.
informazioni
And we
oggettive
gathered
sui
objective
materiali,
information about
tecniche
materials,
e
techniques,
sequenza delle fasi
sequence of
esecutive in
executive
tempi.
phases
Ecco,
and
queste
goals.
informazioni hanno orientato
This
il nostro
information
approccio,
oriented our approach
ai dipinti
to
murali
the
che abbiamo
wall
analizzato.
paintings we
Ne abbiamo
analyzed.
analizzato in totale 10,
10 of them
in parte a Milano, in parte a Reggio
in
Emilia,
Milan, in Reggio
che
Emilia,
sono i comuni parte del
the
progetto
municipalities being partner
Tuttavia, in
to
questa
the Capus
sede,
project.
noi non descriveremo
However, here we
le
will not
opere o i
describe the
contenuti
works or the
delle
contents
interviste.
of the
Per la
interviews.
qualcosa rimandiamo
So
al
you
sito
can
Digital
see
Repository,
them in
dove
the
sono in via di
digital
caricamento.
repository. They are
Perché il
being
fuoco della nostra
uploaded right now. But the focus
sarà
of
posto
our
sul nostro
speech
procedere,
in particular
esemplificato
will
attraverso il caso rappresentativo.
concern our
Risulta
way of
evidente che
procedures,
la
our
scelta
way
di
of
questo caso
proceeding,
rappresentativo
in particular
non è
the
di ordine
choice of
qualitativo,
a
cioè non stiamo
representative
analizzando
case
qualitativamente le
is
opere o gli
not
artisti
in
conosciuti,
qualitative
ma
terms,
è di
but
ordine
we focus
metodologico.
on the
E quindi
methods.
lascio la parola a
Now I
Grazia
give the
per
floor
entrare
to
nel
Grazia
merito della
to
struttura
enter into
dell'intervista.
details and to explain you how to organize the interview. The approach and methodology to prepare and carry out the interviews were developed based on the work, experience, and material collected by all the project partners. You see them here, and in particular by Professor Sajita Sunara, the University of Split, who is head of the relevant unit. As main bibliographic reference, we consider two very useful texts for the creation of a shared protocol on the artist's interview for the documentation of contemporary artwork and its conservation and potential restoration. So the first is Guide to Good Practice Artist Interviews, and on the right, the artist interview for conservation, presentation of contemporary art guidelines and practice. The artist interview is a method of investigation and direct collection of data about a work of contemporary art that can provide valuable information and can guide the conservator in understanding the work and therefore adopting the right approach to its possible conservation. First of all, we can understand the idea and the message conveyed by the work, the materials and techniques used, the meaning of specific techniques or materials, some useful information on the installation of the work, in particular for contemporary art, and the indication on the right display and the view of the artist about future conservation treatments. And this is a key moment to assess the opportunity to preserve the work in the future. Interviews can be organized in different ways. Could be written through letter or email, or questionnaires, or orally like a phone call or face-to-face interview or a video remote interview. The subject of the interview can be the entire production of the artist or specific type of work, or the collection interview or specific one, as in our case. Before the interview, of course, you have to be well prepared. You have to meet your interlocutor after collecting information and documents on the artist and on the work. You have to study the artist's bio, its artistic production in general, and to focus on the work in particular, title, date, technical techniques and materials, meaning, and the conservation and restoration history, if you can, of course, find it. And then it is useful to choose the interviewer, if it's the conservator, like in our case, or if you can have the conservator plus the art historian or the curator or the conservation scientist. You have to choose the place where to carry out the interview. Of course, if the artist agrees, can be by his or her studio or home. The studio is an interesting place for us because you can also have a look at the materials or the conditions and buy the work. That could be another ideal place, so that you can have and manage and run the interview in front of the work of art. Before the interview, of course, you have to introduce yourself in a detailed way. You have to be concise, explain who you are and why you would like to organize this interview, make arrangements with the artist on the location and the different interview methods, so that they can be ready to the questions they will receive. You have to calculate the time that is necessary to, provide an answer to your questions. And if we consider to interview several artists, it's better to provide a uniform approach to questions, so that you can compare the different answers. You always have to plan how to record it, if it's just audio or video. Always remind to take pictures documenting the interview itself. Prepare the disclaimer in advance, and of course you have to ask the artist for his or her consent to use the videos or the pictures taken during the interview. Prepare a checklist of the materials you have to have with you, on you. It could be, for example, the battery charger or a recorder. And if you are not in front of the work, prepare some images that can be useful for the interview, to remember some details or other interesting hints for the interview. You can either print the pictures or, have it on your device. While preparing your questions, it's very useful to follow a specific structure of the interview by topics, so that you can have an overview of all the topics dealt with. So you can start from general questions, so the bottom of the architecture of the pyramid, up to more specific questions. So you can use, for example, general questions as an introduction to the artist or his or her creative process. And then you can ask questions about the meaning of the work and its relationship with the context. And in particular, in this case, it is very important. Then move to specific questions on materials and techniques adopted. And then maybe questions on aging and deterioration of the work and of its materials. And then you can move to the topic concerning the life of the work and the topic of conservation and restoration. When you analyze the answers you obtained to your questions, you should always consider the fact that these answers are subjective. I mean, they are related to the personal context of the artist. While for the technical details, such as materials and techniques, you could analyze the information you obtain with objective data, like, for example, sample analysis or photographs in archive, and cross, of course, testimonies and witnesses of other people being present when the work of art was created. And it's normal. Maybe the artist cannot remind all the details that for conservators are indeed very useful. And so it's important to double check all the information obtained. And then some tips. Of course, probably you have other tips based on your experience, but you always learn from your mistakes. So it's useful to give a clear boundary at the beginning of the interview. Let's avoid talking about interesting subjects when the recorder is off, for example. If several interviewers are there, share the questions, ask one question at a time, avoid any overlapping, allow time to the interviewee, to think about the answer, and knowing how to interrupt politely, of course, if the respondent goes off topic, and maybe this, of course, it's up time to other questions that are crucial for our interview, and ask short and open-ended questions. It's useful to record only audio, even if you are shooting a video. Take pictures to document other works, maybe that the artists want to show you, or other material and tools. Try to have an open posture, a relaxed posture. Of course, being professional, but also allow for an informal moment. Taking notes during the interview could be very useful, because maybe during the conversation you can think about new questions that you didn't jotted down. After the interview, remember to sign the disclaimer. Make the transcription as soon as possible, taking note on additional thought that can emerge during transcription. And then if you have any further question, contact the artist as soon as
va
possible.
condivisa con
Once the
l'intervistato,
transcript
l'intervistata,
is ready, you
e
have to
dopodiché
send it to
posso
the
fare
artist so that
revisione e
they
approvare la
can
versione
review and
definitiva.
approve the final version.
Lascio la parola ad
And now I give the
Alessandra.
floor
Segue.
back to Alessandra.
Cambiare un attimo. Ecco. Bene, quindi per approcciare consapevolmente
So
un'opera,
to
come da
consciously
protocollo per
approach a
l'arte
work of art
contemporanea,
as per the
è
protocol for
opportuno entrare in
contemporary
dialogo
art,
con gli artisti
you
per
need to
comprendere la
create a
poetica in
dialogue with
relazione ai
the
mezzi
artist
espressivi
to
che rendono
understand
il loro
their poetics
rapporto
in
con il
relation to the
contesto
means
e
of expression,
l'interesse per la
clarifying their
conservazione delle
relationship
proprie
with the
opere.
context and
Tuttavia
interest
abbiamo
in the
osservato
preservation of
che
their works.
altrettanto
We
essenziale
also
entrare
observe
in
that it is
rapporto, in
fundamental
dialogo con il
to
contesto,
create
quando è possibile,
an
non è così
opportunity
ovvio,
of
cioè il
dialogue
contesto che si
where
può
possible with the context itself.
qualificare quale la
That could be
committenza
considered
per
as the
comunque
client or
qualsiasi realtà
any
che sia partecipe e
reality
fruisca di questa
that
immagine.
participates and benefits from that
Ecco, e quindi
image,
per
from that
esemplificare
work of
questa
art.
metodologia
So, to
descritta,
exemplify our
abbiamo
methodology,
scelto di
we
raccontarvi
decided
il
to
caso
tell you
studio
about the case
relativo al
study
murale
of the
Niguarda antifascista.
Niguarda
Che
antifascista
appunto
mural.
è particolarmente come dire,
This work
rappresentativo proprio anche per la vivezza del
is
contesto.
particularly
Quindi
representative also for
quest'opera è
the
stata realizzata, come già
participatory
diceva
liveliness
Clara,
of the
dal
context.
collettivo
As Clara was
Ghostwriters,
saying, it
ovvero
was
i writer
created
del
by
popolo.
the
Ecco,
Volkswriters,
di
this
loro vi ha già
collective
parlato
movement.
Chiara, sottolineo che comunque
Clara
è un
already
collettivo a densità variabile,
talked about
cioè
them.
non esiste
It's
come
a
soggetto individuale.
variable density
Quindi la nostra
collective
intervista in
movement.
questo
It does
caso
not
ha dovuto
exist as an
rivolgersi a
individual
una
subject.
persona
So for
che è
our
più o meno
interview, we had to
referente,
contact a person that
per
is
rivolgersi
the
a titolo
person
organizzativo a
of
questo
reference of
gruppo.
this group, of this
Quindi
collective
l'intervista è
movement. And so
stata
the
rivolta a
interview
livello
was therefore
individuale,
addressed to
lui ha
one
risposto
of
a
the
titolo
subjects
individuale e non di tutto
of
il
the group,
gruppo.
and this person
Come
responded
vi dicevo, il
as
murale
an
è
individual,
stato
not
dipinto
on
in via
behalf of the
Ettore
group.
Majorana,
So this mural was
angolo via
painted in
Graziano
via Ettore
Imperatore,
Majorana, corner via Graziano
luogo
Imperatore,
che
a
storicamente
place that
delimitava i
historically
confini
delimited the
della
boundaries
cittadina di
of the
Niguarda
village,
prima
the
che
town
nel
of Niguarda,
1923 fosse
before it
annessa
was
alla
annexed
città
to
di
Milan in
Milano, con una
1923,
popolazione che all'epoca
with a
contava
population that
circa
at time
7.600 abitanti.
was of about
Niguarda,
7,600
infatti, ha una propria
inhabitants.
identità
Niguarda, in
municipale
fact, has
molto
its own very strong municipal
perché ha una
identity.
storia
It
secolare
has
assai
a
lunga,
centuries-old
di
history
villaggio agricolo,
as an
bagnato
agricultural
dalle acque del
village
torrente Seveso,
by the
con una
waters of the
produzione che era
Seveso torrent,
prevalentemente
with
vinicola
the
e
production
tessile,
that
con
was
coltivazioni
mainly
di
wine
gelsi
and
per la secca
textiles,
e
with
la
the
presenza di numerose
presence of
finande.
numerous spinning
Abbiamo già
mills.
ville nel Settecento
In
di
the
ricchi
18th century,
commercianti che commerciavano in
we
seta,
find
ville come Villa
villas like
Clerici,
Villa
che poi
Clerici
diventeranno ville di
owned
proprietà
by
immobiliari,
traders, silk traders.
che andavano appunto in villeggiatura
And
a
they
Niguarda come luogo
spent
ottimo per
their
la giornata
holidays
e per le
in
buone
Niguarda,
Comunque,
that
nei primi,
was
questo avviene tra
famous for
700
its
e
water and its fresh air.
Comunque, nei primi
And this
due
was
decenni
at
del
during the
Novecento,
19th
conosce
century.
uno sviluppo
At the beginning of the
industriale
20th century,
che cominciò a
Niguarda
scomparire
knows
già
an
negli anni
industrial
80
development
nelle aree dismesse
which
dalle
since the
fabbriche
80s
c'è
began to
un'alta densità
disappear.
abitativa.
And now
Però
the areas of
questa
factories are
Niguarda
highly populated by,
operaia,
but of this
rimane la traccia, il segno,
working Niguarda
come dire,
remains the urban
urbanistico,
sign
che ha tracciato il
that the
movimento
cooperative
cooperativo
movement
di
has
questo
traced
luogo, al
over
punto
time
che era così
And it was so widespread and so well known, I mean, this cooperative movement, that over the 80s gave the name to Niguarda as a Niguarda cooperative village. And this is extremely important because this advantage, the fact of having cheap houses, has meant that people were not forced to move away from the area, and so this preserved the identity of this neighborhood. It is not therefore a satellite district born as a result of the Italian economic boom of the 50s and 60s without a historical core. From testimonies collected until the 70s, the inhabitants of Niguarda, when they had to leave the neighborhood, they said, okay, let's go to Milan. And they wanted to stress the separation from the city of Milan, therefore reaffirming their feeling of identity. And this feeling was reinforced by the pride of the partisan fight. As Clara was saying, the liberation of Milan from the fascist government and the Nazi invasion started with the insurrection of Niguarda on April 24th, and April 25th the entire city was freed. And so the facts of that day are represented in the mural painting a few meters away from the place where Leah was murdered, and she was together with Lalla, they were on their bikes, and she was shot by Nazi soldiers. So this proximity gives the work the value of a memorial work. The facts are represented to the left and the right of the inscription, and they are depicted starting from photos of that time. So the work was painted in 2014. It is about 42 meters long by 4 meters high, and it was commissioned by AMPI, the National Association of Italian Partigiani, so the partisan, the resistance to the fascism, and with the sponsorship of the area council. It was painted in mixed media on a rough concrete wall prepared with an outdoor quartz paint, and then painted with a brush with water tempera, with copolymers and spray. As Clara was saying, it was repeatedly vandalized with eggs full of paint or insulting symbols. And as repeatedly it was retouched or restored, both by the artists and by the local inhabitants. Maybe they retouch it in the simple parts of the work. So 7 times vandalized and 7 times retouched with, of course, always different colors. And this intervention was documented in the local press. So this layering of paint is extremely interesting to understand the attachment of the inhabitants to their wall. And this layering, of course, it's very interesting from a conservation point of view.
come dire, crea una sorta di
And
patchwork
this, of
nelle
course,
varie
creates
alterazioni.
a
Anche
kind of
questo
patchwork in
curioso.
their
Ora lascio
alterations.
nuovamente la
So
parola
now I
a
give back
Grazia
the
per
floor
entrare
to
nello
Grazia
specifico del nostro fare e del rapporto con il
to
contesto.
better understand our procedures and the relationship with the context.
Dunque, l'esperienza di scoperta e
So
di
the
conoscenza
experience
del
of
contesto
discovery
urbano,
and knowledge
sociale
of
e
the
umano
urban,
connesso
historical,
all'organizzazione
social, and
della
human
facilità del
context
supporto
connected to the work, of
Abbiamo quindi
course,
deciso di
made
condividere i
our
passaggi di
survey
questo
investigation
avvicinamento,
very
includendone
interesting.
le potenzialità
We decided to
nei
share the
termini di
steps
un
of this
corretto
approach,
approccio
sensing
all'osservazione e
its
all'ascolto,
potential in
come
terms of a
elementi
correct approach to
indispensabili
observation and
quando un
listening
restauratore
as
si trova di fronte a
fundamental
un'opera
when a
ontologicamente
conservator is
complessa
faced
o un
with
murale d'arte urbana, strettamente
ontologically
legato quindi
complex
al contesto
work
e
linked
portatore di un determinato
to a
messaggio.
context and
Messaggio
bearer
specifico.
of a specific message.
Per prima cosa abbiamo mosso i primi
First,
passi della ricerca semplicemente
we
passeggiando
started
in questo
our
grande
research
luogo per
just by
osservare l'intorno,
walking near the
passaggio di
place,
persone,
and we
automobili,
observed the
mezzi pubblici,
surroundings, users,
girellando,
passage of
diciamo, per le
people,
10 prime
traffic,
stanze,
cars, public
muovendoci al
transport,
traffico.
and just to
Semplici e brevi ripetute visite
observe the
nella zona
surrounding
hanno permesso di
streets.
farci un'idea
Simple,
dell'ambiente,
short,
del
and
suo
repeated
contesto,
visits
dell'essenza
in the area
dell'opera e del
allowed
suo
us to get an
significato
idea
nel
of the
paesaggio
environment, of
urbano.
the users of the work, and its meaning in the urban
In questa prima
area.
fase è molto utile prendere
In this
appunti
first
di tutte
step,
le
first
osservazioni
phase, it is
emerse,
very
le
important to
domande che
take
sorgono,
notes of
fare
all the
fotografie
observations,
e poi
of the
formulare
questions you
anche
might
le
have,
proprie
take
ipotesi
pictures,
sul
and
perché quell'opera proprio in
assume
quel luogo.
why the work was created in that very place.
Dopo una prima idea spontanea ed
So after a
esperienziale,
first
abbiamo
spontaneous
proseguito poi
and
con la
experiential
ricerca in
idea,
base
we
alle
went on
informazioni
with the
disponibili
basic
sull'opera,
research of all
allo
the
scopo
available
di
information
rintracciare
about the
i
work,
contatti utili
to find
all'intervento persone
useful
rappresentative
contacts
del
and
contesto,
to, of
ma anche ad
course,
acquisire le
approach
informazioni
people
essenziali
representing
sulla
the
genesi
context and to
dell'opera.
acquire the essential
Questo passaggio è
information
senz'altro
about the
utile
creation
anche
of
in
the work,
preparazione di un
its
incontro con il
history and
contesto,
message.
non volendo
And this
trovarsi totalmente ignari
part
di
is
quelli ossia
very
informati
useful
e
even when you have to
istruiti.
prepare the meeting with the context.
Rintracciati quindi i riferimenti delle realtà
So
rappresentative del
after
contesto, in
finding
questo
all
caso
the information
l'Associazione
about
Partigiani d'Italia,
this area, in
Committenti
particular
dell'Opera,
the
appunto,
National Association
della
of
sezione dei
Partisan,
martiri niguardesi, abbiamo
the
scelto di
client of the
contattarli
work, we
telefonicamente.
decided to call them
Trovando
over the
così a
phone.
condurre il primo contatto con persone che non si aspettavano la nostra
During the
telefonata, né
first
tantomeno la curiosità
approach,
sulla
these people
da parte dei restauratori di opere d'arte,
were not expecting
abbiamo
our
dovuto
phone
raccogliere
call.
le idee
And so
in
we
modo da
had to
sintetizzare
first
una nostra
gather our
presentazione in modo da
ideas
far
in
arrivare in
order
modo
to
chiaro
be
e
short and
veloce le informazioni
concise
di
and to
base su chi
immediately
siamo,
convey
cosa
the information
cerchiamo e
about
perché.
who we are,
È utile
what we are
tenere a
looking
mente
for,
che
and
spesso
why.
il nostro
Eh,
interlocutore
We
può non
have to
essere
keep in mind
familiare con
that
le tematiche
very often
legate alla
our
nostra
interlocutor
professione
may not be
e che è
familiar
del
with the
tutto
issues
normale
related to
aspettarsi un
our
po' di
job,
diffidenza,
and that it may be
soprattutto
normal
quando
to
già non
expect
ci
a
si
bit of
conosce
mistrust,
o
in
non c'è un
particular
intermediario
if you
come
don't
nel
know
nostro
each other
caso.
and there is no intermediary, like in this case.
In seguito al primo contatto telefonico
So,
abbiamo concordato
after
un
the
incontro
first
che si è
telephone
concretizzato
contact,
in un
we agreed
appuntamento
on a
presso
meeting,
un'altra gelateria della zona di
and we
Niguarda.
met in a
Credevamo che
well-known
saremmo
ice cream
proceduti
shop
verso
in
il murale
Niguarda.
o in un altro
We
luogo
thought we
connesso
would have gone
all'opera.
immediately to the
Invece i nostri
mural or to another
interlocutori,
place
Angelo
connected
Longhi,
to
che
the
è
work,
presidente della
but
sezione
our
Ampi di
interlocutors,
Niguarda, e
Angelo
Antonio Masi,
Longhi,
che è uno storico
president
socio
of the
dell'Ampi e studioso
Niguarda
della storia
section
del
of the
quartiere,
AMPI, and Antonio
che
Masi,
ringraziamo per il tempo che ci
historical
hanno
member of
concesso,
the
ci hanno
AMPI
condotto
Association.
presso l'orto comune
And
di
we thank them,
Niguarda,
of course,
che vedete
for
qui
their
rappresentato
support. They
in
took us
foto.
to the
È un
Orto
giardino
Comune
condiviso,
Niguarda.
un luogo di
It is a
aggregazione del quartiere,
shared
immerso
garden,
nella rigogliosa vegetazione
a
del
place
Parco Nord.
of
In un punto devo
meeting,
dire
of
che ci siamo
aggregation in
chiesti
the
come mai
neighborhood,
ci
in
trovassimo
the
in questo
luxuriant
bellissimo
vegetation of
orto,
the Parco Nord.
e
And we
per quanto
wondered
piacevolissima
why we were
ci
there,
questa
however
cosa,
pleasant it could
però
be.
quello che ovviamente ci aspettavamo era di trovarci davanti
We
all'opera
were
e
surprised by this choice because we
fare
expected to
cose
be
utili
in
alla
front of
nostra
the
ricerca
work.
in senso stretto. Però abbiamo accolto accolto l'invito
We
e
accepted
l'ospitalità
the
dei nostri
invitation and the hospitality of our
ponendoci in
interlocutors.
ascolto e
We listened
fidandoci
to
della
them
loro
and we
volontà a
trusted
raccontarsi
their
in un modo che
willingness to
poi
tell their
si è rivelato
stories
essere
in a
straordinariamente
in
ricco
a
di
way
profondità e
that was
connessioni.
extraordinarily rich in
Abbiamo
depth
infatti
and connections.
compreso, grazie a questa
Indeed,
visita,
thanks
quanto
to
un
this
quartiere
visit,
fosse
we
ricco di una
understood
comunità
how much
consapevole, attiva e
neighborhood was
variegata
rich
e
in a
di come ancora
conscious,
oggi, ad esempio,
proactive,
si
and
agricola in
varied community,
Niguarda,
and how the agricultural roots of Niguarda
Inoltre,
are still alive
l'incontro
today.
non si è limitato
And the
all'orto, ma è
meeting
proseguito presso gli edifici storici della cooperativa
continued
edificatrice
by the
Abitare in
historical
via
buildings
Armada,
of the
dove
cooperative build Abitare in Via
risiede la sezione
Armada,
AMPI di
where
Niguarda
the
e il
HQ
teatro
of
della
the
cooperativa, che è
AMPI section of
un'importantissima realtà
Niguarda
culturale della città di Milano.
is located, and the
La
theater
cooperativa
of the
Abitare,
cooperative.
vedete
You see
dell'immagine
the co-op
dell'androne
Abitare. You see an image of this building was born after three historical building companies were merged between the 19th and the 20th century, an example of a cooperative identity that is still proactive. So the history of the resistance, of the workers' struggles, of women's defense groups are represented in the hallway of the building, in the portcullises of the street, painted by the same Folks Writers Collective of the work, and of course in close connection with the focus of our survey. So it is evident that it's important not to be hasty in acquiring information. You should, on the contrary, remain open to the unexpected, because what we do not foresee, it's probably richer than what we in the end find and we expected to find. The guided tour was followed by a planned interview where we asked Angelo Longhi relevant information about the work, its commission, genesis, and history. The interview took place in the Orto Niguarda, prepared following the guidelines we explained before. And so this witness, together with the bibliography, archive images provided by our interlocutors, allowed us to precisely document the context of the work of art. After a few months, we were invited to talk about our research at a fundraising dinner aimed at remaking some portions of the painting by the artists themselves. That was the moment in which we were called upon to give back what we did and to share the reasons for our interest, motivations of our intentions, as well as the object of our profession in the context of this particular work of contemporary art. We observed on part of the community a sort of jealous love towards the work, perceiving a slight distrust concerning our role as conservators, as we were potential alien invaders of their field. But when we made clear that our research was not aimed at intervening on the work, but first of all, it was aimed at understanding and studying it, we clearly perceived their reassurance and relaxation, so they were more open towards us. So our invitation is to always participate in moments where it is useful to tell one's history, to satisfy the curiosity of the context, to answer questions, and of course to share visions. The same thing happened during the operational phases of our research. Here you see Alessandra and Davide Ricciardi when they carried out the condition report of the work, and then samples were taken and they were analyzed. And during this moment, it is essential to involve the context in the operations we plan to perform.
principio di condivisione,
always
scambio
by
di idee.
following this principle
È
of
utile però
sharing
dedicare un
and
tempo
exchange of
specifico
ideas.
all'illustrazione di quello che
It is
stiamo
useful to
facendo,
devote a specific
perché,
moment to
diciamo,
explain what we
potremmo
are doing,
essere noi distratti dalla
because
presenza
we
di
might be
qualcuno, quindi dobbiamo
distracted by the
spiegare le
presence
varie
of
fasi
somebody
del nostro intervento,
to which we
oppure
have to
cercheremo di usare la
explain the
dovuta
different
attenzione
phases
alle
of
persone
our
che vengono
action,
in
or
visita,
maybe
diciamo.
we
Quindi o
do
stabiliamo
not
un
attach
momento
the
in cui
right attention to
diciamo,
our
interrompiamo il
guest.
nostro
So
lavoro e ci dedichiamo alla sua spiegazione,
either
oppure
we
magari una
plan
persona
a
del
specific
gruppo si
moment
dedica
for this, or maybe a
esclusivamente
person of the group
a questa operazione di
is
coinvolgimento.
devoted exclusively to
È
this
stata
involvement
consegue
operation.
raccontarvi sempre la
And then
partecipazione,
Alessandra now will tell us about this involvement
Ecco, sì,
phase.
perché dopo la cena
So
sociale
after the
che era stata
social dinner
fatta per finanziare
that was
la
organized
ridipintura
to
del
fund the
murale,
repainting of the
siamo stati
mural,
invitati dagli
we were
artisti
invited by
alla
the artist
ridipintura
to
che in
the
gergo è
repainting
chiamata la pittata,
that it's
che
called
è
a
stata
pittata
svolta
in
nel
Italian,
pomeriggio del
that
13
was
aprile
carried
del
out on the
19,
afternoon of
alla
April
presenza
13,
degli abitanti del
2019,
quartiere, ormai
in
molti
front of
noti,
the
che come noi
neighborhood
stavano
inhabitants
osservando l'evento.
who, like us, were attending the event. And of
La
course, we now
ridipintura
consider
ha
them as familiar
riguardato le
faces.
scritte e i
Repainting
fondi,
involved the lettering and the
scusate,
backgrounds.
ecco, ha riguardato le scritte e i fondi. Infatti si
It
trattava
was
di
a matter
uniformare
of
i colori delle
unifying the
scritte, cioè
colors
come
in
prima
lettering.
avete
As you
osservato,
saw
c'era
before,
questa
there was this
stratificazione, a volte anche scagliata,
layering,
e i colori
sometimes
che
a
erano di
wrong
natura
layering,
diversa, nelle
different colors
sequenze sovrapposte,
in the
erano
overlapping
anche
sequences,
alterati in
and they
maniera
were
diversa,
even
perciò era
altered.
un po' un patchwork.
So
Quindi
that's
si
why
trattava di
I
dare uniformità
defined
a
it
questi
as a
fondi
patchwork. We had
e
to
ridare vivezza, ecco quello che non farebbe
bring
mai un
back
restauratore,
vividness
ma lo fa un artista,
to
ridare vivezza
the
ai colori, in questo
faded
caso del
colors of the
cielo, che
sky.
erano ormai sbiaditi. E ritornando al colore
And of course, we
originale.
wanted
Ecco,
to
questo era un
recreate the
periodo
original color.
particolare, perché era una primavera estremamente
It was
instabile,
a
quindi
weird
era necessario
springtime.
lavorare in fretta
We had
per non
to
incappare nella
be
pioggia.
quick
Questo è stato
in
uno dei
our
motivi per cui è
intervention
stato
in
scelto
order
di
to
lavorare
avoid rain.
essenzialmente a
So
spray.
that's why
Come
we
vedete sono stati
decided to work
utilizzati gli
with
spray
the spray
Montana,
cans, the spray
e
Montana.
nel gruppo si sono riuniti 6 artisti, quindi un
6
pomeriggio 6
artists
artisti
of
fanno
the group
spray.
worked together, so during
E
an
questo
afternoon
procedere è stato
with the
anche
spray
testimonianza
cans.
del fatto che la successione delle
And this
pitture è
also proved
realizzata
that
con
the
materiali diversi, in quanto,
sequence
per dire,
of
il cielo era
paintings
stato realizzato
was made
con
with
tempera
different
composite
materials. For
11,
example,
spesso perché si
we
trova,
found a
ecco,
sky
quindi
that was painted with
invece
tempera with a
la
brush,
ridipintura è stata fatta
while the
sostanzialmente a spray.
repainting was
Quindi
spray can
questo.
made.
Quello che ci interessa
What we would
sottolineare
like to
è che
underline
quindi è proprio da chi fruisce
it is
l'opera
that
e la
precisely
gradisce
from those
che
who
nasce
enjoy
la
the
richiesta
work
della protettura
and
e
appreciate it
conservazione.
that the
Oltre a
demand for its
partecipare
protection and
per, come dire,
conservation
dipingerlo
arises,
direttamente, non era
and then
questo il caso di quella
they
giornata, ma come
participate,
dire
of course,
anche
as
facendo
well,
cene sociali che
like
finanziano questa
organizing
possibilità.
fundraising
Quindi
dinner.
è da chi gradisce
So
l'opera che nasce la richiesta della
those
sua
who
tutela.
appreciate the
Ma
work
abbiamo osservato che fino a qui la domanda
generate the
è
demand for
rivolta
its protection.
prevalentemente agli artisti
And this
stessi e agli
demand
autori
is
in
mainly
termini
addressed to
di
the artists
ridipintura,
themselves in
perché
terms of
l'idea della
repainting,
conservazione
because
dell'arte
the
urbana è
idea of the
relativamente recente,
conservation of
comunque
urban art
non è
is
entrata nella
relatively
consapevolezza
recent
comune e qualche
and
volta è
has
divisa
not
anche agli
yet
artisti
entered into
stessi.
common
Diciamo che
awareness
prende
and is often
corpo
invisible even to the artists themselves.
più in rapporto al fenomeno dell'arte
It is more
commissionata, in
related
quanto
probably to the
alla fine
phenomenon of
esprime anche un
commissioned
po'
art,
intrinsecamente una
because
volontà
it
di
also
durata, per dire,
expresses
preparando i supporti,
a desire for
che sono
duration.
all'origine, che sono uno degli elementi più tremendi come dire, per il degrado dell'opera, no?
And
Il loro
the
diroccare.
use of materials, and of
Ecco,
course this is strictly connected to the
In tutto questo vorremmo
deterioration.
concludere con una
So I
riflessione
would
di
like to
Ivan,
conclude with a
che è
reflection
uno
by
degli
Ivan,
artisti
one
che abbiamo
of the artists
intervistato
we
e che
interview,
ben si adatta al caso di Niguarda. Tuttavia è
which
comunque
fits
un
well with the
concetto, secondo voi,
Niguarda
da tenere a
case
mente.
and something we should
Ovvero
always keep
che
in mind.
indipendentemente dal
So,
fatto che
regardless
un'opera
whether a
sia
work of art
legale
is
o
legal
illegale,
or
è
illegal,
importante considerare se
it
sia
is important to
legittima
consider
o
if it is
illegittima
legitimate
nel
or
contesto in cui
illegitimate in the
realizzata,
context in which it is
intendendo con
made.
questo concetto
And by this we mean
l'appropriatezza o
the
meno di
appropriateness
occupare uno
of
spazio tra gli
occupying a
abitanti di un
space
certo luogo
of a certain
in
place
termini di
in terms
gradimento
of
e rappresentatività,
appreciation and
ovvero
representativeness.
un'opera può essere
So a
avere
work
tutti
can
i
be
crismi della
legal,
legalità, ma non essere
but
affatto
not
gradita
appreciated
nel
by the
contesto.
people living in the
A
area.
differenza,
Or
un'opera può essere
a
assolutamente
work can be
illegale, ma
absolutely
tutelata
illegal
dalla
but
comunità
highly
perché sentita
appreciated and
come
protected by the
rappresentativa, e questo
community
ci
because
sembra
it is considered as
un taglio molto
representative.
interessante da
And I think
considerare.
this is a really interesting
Ecco, abbiamo
observation.
concluso
We
e
are at
uno
the
speciale
end,
ringraziamento
and a
all'AMPI
special
di
thank to the
Niguarda.
Niguarda
Grazie.
AMPI.
Grazie mille per lo splendido intervento di cui mi preme sottolineare
Thank you for your speech.
anche, diciamo, che si tratta di un
And
percorso che è stato
it
poi
was
anche il
a
percorso su
pathway
altre opere,
that
come quella di Niguarda si prestava particolarmente
concerned
perché
other works
era
as well.
un'attività, però ecco, è stato un percorso
So it was a shared pathway by our teams and by all the other project teams. So an investigation of the work with the artist and with the context, and then document all the findings. So there are questions, but I would ask them after Roberto's speech. We have a short break, even with the translator, we can stop for a short break, and we can see each other later with these materials and techniques by Roberto Bestetti.
Ben ritrovati.
Welcome back.
Con la relazione
We now give the floor to Roberto Bestetti, materials and techniques, Vice President of Cesmar 7, conservator of cultural heritage and teacher in courses on paints and retouch colors, and also teachers of history and execution methods, the University of Turin, and teacher of contemporary art restoration in Como. Good morning. A short presentation on materials and techniques for street art and artists. Do you see it?
Sì.
Sì, perfetto, grazie.
Ecco, faccio una breve introduzione sui materiali.
A short introduction about the different materials, that is to say the acrylics, vinyls and house paints.
Materiali nati per altri usi.
So
Tra queste ragioni ci sono le differenze di aspetto.
in the artistic field, there are several reasons why artists began to use materials developed for other use. You see texture, glow, so brilliance and matting, the speed of
E
drying,
soprattutto di contenitori che sono più grandi e più economici
and
per
in
l'artista.
particular the easy availability of containers that are larger and cheaper than artist paints, and some symbolic reason to some extent referable to the rejection of the typical academic materials. A general classification of materials for the industrially produced materials. You see a difference between vinyl polymers together with vinyl esters or acrylic colors. In this case, we are talking about wall paint, so emulsion paint. Or you see house painting enamel that can be a mixture of polyurethanes and acrylics. So we have traditional enamels that are composed of linseed oil or alkyd paint, polyester modified with oils, and here you could of course classify the length of the chain of the substances involved. Nitrocellulose derived from cellulose reacted with nitric acid, and acrylic, in this case solvent based.
Le idropitture che sono usate per
So emulsion paints, for example, to paint houses can be used in this field as well, and they are called emulsion-based paint. For example, they were used by Keith Haring for Tutto Mondo in Pisa. You can find many brands and types of emulsion paints. Generally, the choice is based on the products that are easily available on the market and based on the price as well. Sometimes the execution of the paintings is preceded by the application of quartz paint, even if you want to perform the work with other techniques like the spray can. And in case of commission works and professional artists, we find the use of quality paints such as Sikkens, that was used by even in the Ortica noodles as well. A short overview on the history of this material. The vinyl emulsion paints appeared on the market at the end of the World War II, followed by acrylic emulsion paints in the 60s. They were based on the well-known resin AC33. In Italy, at least, it is usually believed that the mural water-based paints were cheapest for indoor paints, while outdoor they are considered as more expensive paints, and they are acrylic based. Emulsion paints can also be used as a base for other techniques. Several artists use these materials: Ortica Noodles, Ivan Tresoldi, Blue, FX Collective, and many others. Emulsion paints are based on thermoplastic resins and to be produced and then applied in a water content. They must include several additives, surfactants, emulsifiers, dispersants, anti-freeze, anti-mold, buffer, pH, stabilizers, and coalescent solvents. Some additives evaporate during the drying time, while others can remain in the painting film and then may be washed out over time.
Qui abbiamo due esempi di opere che sono condotte con
We
pittura in
have a
emulsione.
couple of
A sinistra un'opera di
examples
blu,
of emulsion
a
paint
Valencia,
works
un'opera attribuita a
on the
Valencia,
left attributed to blue, but it is not tagged, and a detail of the collective work at the Fabbrica del Vapore performed by
Abbiamo visto
Ivan.
prima il muro dedicato a Khaled al-Assad.
Before we saw the wall dedicated to Khaled al-Assad, this is the other side of the wall at the Fabbrica del Vapore, attributed to Nelson Mandela. This work was created by several artists, Otica Noodles and Power Anais, with a spray painting, and while the other with emulsion paint. And then we have house paints or enamels. In this category you see all these solvent-based paints used before the introduction of spray cans, and they can be used as an alternative of together with the spray itself. You find several brands, Carson, Duco, Ripollin, and so on.
Le pitture a smalto tradizionalmente erano preparate a base di oli
house
seccativi,
paints traditionally consisted of drying oils or linseed oils, while they can be industrially prepared based on soybean, safflower oil, tung oil, or castor oil. And then, of course, you add natural resins that could be coppers, rosin, or dammar.
In seguito all'introduzione delle resine sintetiche,
after introducing synthetic resins, these preparations were replaced by synthetic resins such as nitrocellulose, acrylic or alkyd resins, and they are often associated to oils like safflower or soybean oil.
In campo storico-artistico, il primo artista che ha utilizzato
in the art history field, the first artist used this material in 1912 and is Picasso. He used Ripollin in Paris and was based on drying oils and probably natural resins. And then later on, Picasso used the Ripollin enamel in Antibes for the works performed in Antibes in the 40s. While the first artist who used a synthetic material to paint is Siqueiros, Maria mentioned him, and he used the pyroxylin, so Duco enamel, that were created for the automotive industry, that at that time was really growing, and this during the 30s. And the use of enamel is also documented by other artists such as Picabia, Kandinsky, and Balla, but it was pretty used at that time. Siqueiros took it together with the use of enamel, also introduced another important technique, that is the spray gun, and of course this was taken by the automotive industry, and the enamel and the spray gun were introduced in a process of adapting mural techniques to contemporary architecture. That changed materials, so we find concrete surfaces, and according to Siqueiros, the traditional painting techniques were not suitable any longer, and so Siqueiros decided to write a handbook on how to paint on a mural on a wall, and it was then published in Italy in 1976. So the connection between enamel painting and spray can is immediate. Spray cans are the most used tool in the writing and the street art world. Spray cans began to spread out during World War II when they were used for pesticides. And then in 1949 they were used with colors. And since then we have multiple brands and products and the different lines. And today we have specific conceived products for writers, such as Montana or Molotov lines. So spray paint binders include modified alkyd resin, acrylic binder, solvent-based, modified polyurethane, which is the equivalent of water-based spray, and nitroalkyd, so a mixture of nitrocellulose and alkyd resins, typical of the spray cans produced in the 70s up to the 90s, but which are still in use. The application by spray cans can change its effect by replacing the caps, and there is a specific production for street art and writers. You see the fine lines for the outlining up to the fat caps to fill the larger surfaces. And then we have markers, which spread since the 50s, and of course today there are countless commercial products. Markers can also be handcrafted by using plastic bottles filled with dyes or inks, the specific one you selected, and by creating the tip with a sponge or a felt. If these markers are filled with acids, they can produce permanent tags, for example, on glass. You can also find some empty markers that are sold specifically for writers, so that they can be filled with the desired ink. And they, of course, create specific lines for graffitis and Montana and Molotov. Just an example. You have three types of markers: water-based paints with acrylic binder, the Uniposca type. And then you have alcoholic solvent and synthetic resin, and markers with alcohol-based dye, just one dye. Here we were testing the different cleaning techniques with an alcohol-based marker. The color is made up by a binder, but also by a pigment. And now I would like to refer only to organic pigments. They have no counterpart in nature, they are synthetic. And they are created as coloring compounds insolubilized through chemical processes. In this way, you obtain a pigment that by definition is insoluble in the binder used. They are often carbocyclic compounds, so you have rings of C atoms, and then you have chromophores imparting the color to the molecule. You can also find functional groups altering the main color, but in a chemical way.
esempio la phthalocyanina blue shade.
That's
Blue shade
how
non
you
viene,
obtain the
fatto addizionando un
phthalocyanine, the
altro
blue
colorante blu, ma
shade. It's
addizionando sia
not by
molecolar
adding
dei
another blue
gruppi
agent,
funzionali che gli
but
danno
by
una
selecting the
tonalità più
molecule
blu.
of the functional groups. Therefore, according and
I pigmenti
giving
organici
a
sono una
blue
categoria
shade, an
estremamente
extra blue shade.
vasta di composti. Si
So there are a
contano
lot of
decine
components.
e decine, se non
You can
migliaia
count
di
up to
possibilità.
thousands of possibilities,
E hanno delle caratteristiche
and
particolari,
they have
diverse dai pigmenti a
particular
cui i ristoratori sono
characteristics, and
abituati.
they are
In
different
particolar
from the
modo sono
pigments
pigmenti che hanno un
to
alto,
which
se non
conservators are
altissimo potere
used.
colorante,
They have a strong
e
coloring
insieme sono anche
power,
trasparenti.
and they are
Quando i
also
pigmenti
transparent.
tradizionali o sono poco coloranti
Well,
e di conseguenza anche
traditional pigments are
poco coprenti,
low.
oppure
I
sono
mean,
molto
they
coloranti
low. They
e sono anche molto coprenti, come il
not.
caso dei colori
They are
pittanti.
low colorant, or they are high colorant and high covering, like
Questi
cadmium,
colori
for
sono
example,
sono
pigments.
moltissimo usati nell'industria, sono
These
usati nei colori
coloring
sintetici, sono
agents
usati
are
nei colori
used
caratteristici,
in synthetic
negli
colors,
studio,
in
negli smalti,
enamels,
nelle
in
bombolette
spray cans,
ovviamente, nei concentrati per idropittura
in concentrates for
e nei
water-based
pennarelli,
paints and
e sono
markers.
spesso la causa della perdita di colore
And they
delle
are
opere
often the
pittoriche quando sono
cause of a
esposte
loss of color of
all'esterno, soprattutto in relazione al fenomeno che
painting
chiamate
works
fading,
when
quindi
they
proprio
are
la vera e propria
exposed
perdita di
to
colore.
light source,
Sappiamo
and
anche che le
this
mescolanze
phenomenon
col titanio,
is
che
called
col bianco di
fading.
titanio, che
We also
spesso
know that by
avvengono
mixing
in
these
ambito di
components
formulazione
with the
industriale,
titanium
possono
weight
peggiorare questo
can
fenomeno.
increase and therefore can
Qui faccio una brevissima carrellata di
worsen this phenomenon.
tecniche
Here I would like to show you different
basandomi sul
street
glossario
art
di
and
termini
graffiti
che sarà
techniques
a breve pubblicato.
based on the glossary that will soon be
Per graffiti si
available and
intendono
published.
dei disegni fatti su
So by graffiti
su una
we mean
superficie,
drawings made on a
generalmente
surface
come forma di espressione artistica,
as
quindi
a
graffiti
form of
metropolitani.
artistic expression. So,
Spesso
for example,
senza il
metropolitan
permesso
graffitis,
dei
and
proprietari
often
delle opere
without
stesse,
permission
sono
of
esposti
the
alla
property
visione
owners
pubblica.
within public
Si
view.
fa riferimento per i graffiti agli anni 70 a New York come data di nascita per i graffiti metropolitani.
Graffitis, metropolitan
all'interno
graffitis
della
were born
cultura hip
in New
hop
York in the
e
70s
del
inside
circuito degli
the hip hop culture and in their subcultures.
coloro che eseguono i graffiti sono chiamati appunto writer
The graffiti artists are called writers or taggers. They are strictly related to the street art,
ne differiscono negli intenti,
but they differ in their aim. In particular, graffiti writers send their message to a specific group of people.
Mural lo sappiamo bene,
Mural,
sono semplicemente
we know them. They are
delle opere pittoriche eseguite su pareti, interne o esterne edifici, su volte.
painting works on walls.
Generalmente questi dipinti murali sono in relazione
And
stretta con l'architettura.
these mural paintings are related to architecture, the architecture of the wall of the building. So wall paintings are often commissioned.
Street art invece è un termine più fluido.
Street art
la sua definizione è ancora soggetta
can be
a
considered as a more fluid term because its definition is still in evolution and an ongoing definition. It's a visual art created in urban spaces or building walls, highway overpasses or sidewalks, and it makes street art as a phenomenon that is strictly connected with graffiti.
Non tutta la street art coinvolge la pittura. Anzi, possiamo dire che
the street art does not always involve painting. There are several techniques that are involved. Could be, for example, sculpture, the use of stencils, stickers, or posters, installations, and other techniques that we will shortly explain.
dei graffiti si fa riferimento al
Within the
piece o
graffiti
masterpiece,
word, you refer to piece or
appunto
masterpiece.
per un pezzo dipinto di grandi dimensioni,
For a big
complesso,
size
per cui
portion
l'esecuzione
that
viene
is
richiesta
painted,
tempo e sforzi,
a
anche di
complex mural,
progettazione.
the execution of which
Fa
requires
uso di
time and
elementi complessi
planning,
come forme 3D,
because it
personaggi,
uses
anche
3D
personaggi provenienti
elements,
dalla cultura pop, o cartoni animati,
graphic
eccetera,
signs,
e
or
segni
for
grafici,
example,
fiamme, frecce,
specific
sono
people
i
are
lavori su cui il
depicted,
writer acquisisce rispetto
flames,
all'interno della
or
comunità dei writer
you see
stessi.
different
Possono essere
type
lavori
of drawings.
improvvisati, ma
They
molto
can be
spesso sono lavori
spontaneous
che
or
hanno
improvised works, but very often
un lavoro di progettazione
they have
notevole,
behind
basato
a
su schizzi
design
e un
process
processo
with
di
sketches
elaborazione
and
curata prima
even sketches on
dell'esecuzione
paper
sulla
before
parete visiva.
executed it on the wall.
Invece con bubble style
Bubble
intendiamo
style, by bubble style,
stile
we
semplice
mean
di writing
a simple
basato su
writing
lettere
style
arrotondate
based
e
on
facilmente leggibili.
bubble-shaped
È
letters,
un
usually
modo
easy
considerato
to
forse
read.
vecchio e un po'
It
troppo
is
semplice
probably
di intendere il writing,
an
che
outdated
è la facilità di esecuzione.
way of
E per questo
considering
motivo è
writing.
la tecnica, lo stile utilizzato
And
per
this
i
is
throw-up,
the
che vediamo ora.
style used
I throw-up sono
for
una forma semplice
throw-ups,
di graffiti
which
che
are
viene
a simple
dipinta molto
form of
velocemente
graffitis,
su grande
quickly
dimensione,
made,
spesso
large,
lasciando un po' indietro
on
la
large
ricerca
sizes, big
estetica.
sizes,
Letteralmente
and they are
è
not so
tirato
much
su,
focusing
quindi
on
un
aesthetics.
po' eseguito
That's why they
molto
are
velocemente.
called a throw up. So quickly prepared.
Abbiamo l'argentone, quindi sono una di queste opere di
In Italian,
writing
the term is
eseguite
argentone,
con
so
una
made
pittura
on
croma, uno smalto al
silver
chrome.
chrome paint.
Non solo bombolette, però abbiamo anche
We
writing eseguito
not
con
only have spray
rullo,
cans, we
un
have
classico rullo da imbiancature,
writing
che è denominato roller graffiti.
painted
Una tecnica
with
che non è
roller,
utilizzata soltanto
and it's called
nell'ambito
roller
del
graffiti,
writing, ma
and
è
it's
utilizzata anche per opere di street art. Io ho
used
messo
not only
due
in the
esempi,
writing
roller paint
area,
o-
but also in
o
street
per
art.
similitudine anche opere pittoriche
So you have
eseguite
roller
con
paint
aste
or
telescopiche e
with the
pennelli.
telescopic rod or brushes.
Nel caso di destra un'opera di
On
Mauro
the
Blu,
right, this
su
is
cui
by
spero si riescano a
Blue,
intravedere i
the
segni
artist Blue,
delle rullate
and
sulla
I
del
think
fondo.
you might spot the
In questo caso non
different
si tratta, immagino, di
roller
stesure con
signs
aste telescopiche,
on the
ma
white
di
background.
un lavoro eseguito,
So
come
it
spesso
was
avviene per
not
questo
made
artista,
with
calandosi con la
a
corda,
telescopic
quel corde,
rod, but
dalla
the
sommità
artist
della parete.
was hanging
A sinistra
on
invece
the
abbiamo
wall
una
with some ropes.
visione, una vista dall'esterno delle officine
On the
reggiane
left, you have an
di,
external view of
appunto a
the
Reggio Emilia,
Officine
dove
Reggiane
vediamo
in Reggio Emilia,
degli interventi
and you
eseguiti con
see
queste
different
tecniche di roller o di
art
aste
expressions
telescopiche con pennelli.
made by using roller.
Poi abbiamo la
Rollers
sono
or
in
telescopic
genere
roads, and then we
artistico
have
di street art che consiste
a street
nell'utilizzo
installation.
di forme tridimensionali
It
e
consists
di
in
lavori site
using 3D shapes
possono
or
essere
site-specific
appunto sia
works,
interno che
can be
esterno,
performed
e
indoors and
possono un po'
outdoors.
cadere nel campo dell'arte pubblica, della land art.
They
degli
can be
interventi
considered
pubblici o della
in
street
the
art.
domain of
Questi
public
termini
art,
si possono
public intervention, or
un pochino
street art,
sovrappporre.
and so these terms might
Sono
overlap
opere
sometimes.
tridimensionali, quindi fanno uso del linguaggio della scultura in un contesto
So these
urbano.
are
Mi viene
3D
in mente a
works,
Milano
and they
gli
use
Urban
the language of
Solid,
sculpture in a
stessi
street
applicati alle
concept.
pareti,
For example,
magari
in Milan, urban
dipinti di
solid,
supereroi ad
superhero painting, or maybe Adam and Eve.
Possiamo avere piccole figure di plastica,
So you can have
fino a
small
grandi
plastic figures
composizioni,
up to large
ottenute
compositions
con materiali di recupero.
with the
Questo sta
recycled
diventando una delle
objects.
forme di espressione più
And this is
interessanti.
becoming one of the most interesting
Abbiamo due
forms of
esempi.
expression. We have two examples here. On the right, we have a Clet work. It was removed and the artist was sanctioned. It was removed by Florence municipality and the artist just reinstalled it on the Santo Spirito Bridge. And then we have Bordalo II, a Portuguese artist who created big size installations, in particular animals, animal shaped, starting from urban waste. On the right, you see this well-known work in Porto, and this is another work by the same artist. Huge size animals. Some of them are also in Italy. This is another technique, poster paste up. It includes the fact of gluing prints on paper on posters, on urban surfaces. It derives from advertising and, of course, electoral advertising for this type of communication. So, two forms that are extremely used in our cities, and artists turn them into their own communication method. Posters and leaflets have always been the communication channel of subcultures, for example, in organizing concerts, events, demonstrations, and they are used since the beginning. In this way, the work can be conveniently prepared at home, even printed, small or large size based on the need, and then colored if necessary, and then glued on site. There is also this feeling of being less criminal, so to say, by pasting a poster rather than using spray cans. And as I said, posters can be colored before being glued on surfaces. Here you see two examples. Another interesting practice that is always referring to advertising is the ad busting or sub-advertising, is to alter the original meaning of an existing poster or an ad. It's usually with a satirical approach or in a way marked by humor and often sharp criticism against consumerism. Here you see a Duchamp work, and here I go back to the use of enamels. So he modified the advertising plaque of the Rapulin enamel that was sold at the beginning of the 20th century in the United States. So he erased the first letter and turned into Apollinaire tribute. And then we have spray paint stencil. It's one of the most characteristic techniques. Easy, cheap. It can generate a huge impact thanks to the interaction of the substrate, which remains unchanged. It can also be created by using several masks. It's an ancient technique,
come veicolo di protesta
and it
negli
was
anni 70.
used as a
In ambito artistico
vehicle,
grazie
political
a
protest in the
a un artista
70s, and
francese
in
parigino che si
the
chiama Black Le Rat, che questa
art
tecnica viene
sector,
recuperata
it's
e
thanks to a
utilizzata
French
in ambito artistico.
artist called Black
Sarà proprio
Lerat
da Black
that
che
Black
probabilmente
Lerat
Banksy ha
it's
preso l'idea per farla diventare
used
la tecnica che ha la
this
popolarità di oggi.
technique,
Qui si
and
intitola
of course
un'opera di
this
Banksy.
was a source of inspiration to
Gli
Banksy as
stencil
well.
possono facilmente
Stencils
essere preparati
can be
ritagliando cartoni,
prepared by
carti
cutting
o altri
cardboards,
materiali
paper,
che
or
possono,
other materials
così portare a un'immagine che può essere facilmente
that
e
can create
velocemente
an image
eseguita e
that
riprodotta
can be
in serie su
easily
più muri.
reproduced and
Può essere
transfer
stampata,
on multiple
permettetemi il
walls.
termine, sulle pareti attraverso la bomboletta spray
It
oppure attraverso
can be transferred onto a wall with a spray can or roll-on.
Come ho già detto, l'utilizzo di
As
mascherine
I said,
sovrapposte
the
possono
use
portare
of
alla,
overlapping masks can
all'elaborazione di immagini
elaborate
abbastanza complesse
complex
e a più colori,
images
con
with
diversi
different colors and details.
Abbiamo due opere di Black Le Rat.
Here we have
mette in
two
dialogo un po'
works by Black Lerat.
l'arte di strada con l'arte del museo, sono due opere
In
molto
connection
famose,
here you
sono,
see the street
così
art, the
trasformate in
museum
opere di
art.
città. E qui varie fasi della esecuzione
Here you see
del,
different
del,
phases of
della
the
mascherina.
creation of and the use of masks.
È un'opera assai conosciuta di Banksy a Venezia.
This is a well-known
In questo
Banksy's
caso,
work in
come
Venice.
spesso succede,
In this
ogni
case,
intervento
as
a mano
it
libera che precedono o seguono
often
la chiusura della
happens,
mascherina
you
stessa,
have
che spesso ha
freehand
necessità di
actions
correzioni.
before or after the use of mask, because they need to
Come si
be
possono ottenere delle
refined,
immagini,
as it is not a
utilizzabili in queste tecniche?
perfect
L'immagine
procedure.
viene acquisita
So how can you create this stencil?
processore, quindi viene
The
elaborata
image is
attraverso
processed
intensificando la
in
luminosità
Photoshop.
e soprattutto portando al
You
massimo il contrasto.
increase brightness
viene
and
usato un
contrast,
comando
and
che
then
presso
you
la
use the
modifica del valore
threshold
soglia,
option, so you modify the
italiano,
threshold
e
values,
questo porta l'immagine
and this
a essere in
transforms
due
the
toni, quindi
image
adatta per
in
essere
two
ritagliata
tones,
e,
so ready to
riprodotta
be
con una
cut
tecnica
and
come stesso.
reproduced by using the stencil technique.
Un'altra tecnica molto utilizzata nel campo del writing è quella
Another common
degli stickers.
technique in the
Se ci
writing
guardiamo
world
intorno
is
nelle
the
città,
stickers.
ci accorgiamo di essere letteralmente circondati da
We
questi
are
interventi.
definitely
Sono una delle
surrounded
più
by stickers
semplici
in our
tecniche di
cities,
writing
one of the most
e anche delle più sicure. Quindi
simple
è
techniques
ritenuta anche forse più
and
troppo
probably
semplice
even
come
safe.
modalità,
So it's considered probably as too
questo
easy.
genere di tecnica può essere usata anche
And
nel
this
campo della
type
street
of
art, quindi di nuovo
techniques
abbiamo
can
un'opera
also
di
be
Black
used in the
Abrams.
street
Questo
art
artista che
in
fa
area.
una sorta
We
di
have Abrams' work.
subvertising dei
This is a
segnali
kind of a
pubblicitari
subvertising
attraverso
of
l'applicazione
signs by applying stickers.
Qui abbiamo altri due esempi.
Here you have other
Ne ha
examples.
eseguiti moltissimi in moltissime città europee di questi interventi.
You find these forms of art in several European cities. And the artist, for example, the artist in Florence exhibit the fines, the sanctions applied by the municipal institutions. He says that these stickers can be easily removed, while very often the entire sign is removed, while other signs vandalized by other actions are left as they are. So he often says that the municipal institutions collect his works. That's why they tend to replace the sign completely. And then we have plastic film paintings. They are use, for example, the same film used in airports to pack a suitcase can be used, for example, in light posts and so on, and then they can create a base for painting. So they can be used even extra urban context, like in a park or in wood, or they can create this transparent effect. There are specific products on the market. You can find them white, black, and transparent. Then we have the moss graffiti. It means writing not by using a specific paint, but by adapting the moss. Here you see different organic substances are applied on the wall, and so they should, in a way, nourish the moss, which will grow. Even if it's not sure that these recipes are effective, the images we saw online usually see moss that is blended and then glued on the surface. It's a weird technique, but an attractive one, because it links the writing with the guerrilla gardening. What is the guerrilla gardening? Is to improve the aesthetics of a city by planting uncultivated land in the cities, or by using seeds bomb. It started in the 60s, and of course it needs the local participation, otherwise of course it won't last. We have other types of techniques. We could call it subtraction technique. So instead of adding materials on surfaces, some artists remove materials from surfaces, therefore obtaining their image. Could be just by working on the dirt of a surface, so this activity is not illegal, or you can demolish architectural walls. This is the work of a Portuguese artist called Vils. He creates portraits, huge size portraits, by demolishing plasters with several tools, even using explosives or chemicals. Here you see some other examples of these works. The outcome could be related to the stencil art, but it also recalls the graffiti techniques of the Liberty Palaces. It's a technique that is pretty much used in our cities. And then we have the yarn bombing, or the yarn graffiti. So urban surfaces that are covered by yarns, and colorful, of course, yarns. You can find it on fences, sculptures, monuments.
Infine parliamo di street poetry.
And then we have this street poetry, which is included in the context of the Beat generation, and it uses the walls as a base for poetry. Here you see
I
the
cerchi semi al vento
tre
faranno così il
soldi,
cielo,
even tre
oppure può
soldi,
essere
it's
piccoli
poetry,
foglietti di carta
or
applicati
small
o distribuiti sulle
pieces
metropolitane.
of
In
papers
questo
that
modo
are
si fa
applied or
una moltiplicazione esponenziale del pubblico
distributed
della
in the subways, for example.
Grazie per l'attenzione.
Thank you very
Faccio,
much for your
riferimento
attention.
doveroso anch'io al numero 10 della rivista
I would like
Conservación
to
del 2016, in
mention
particolare
number
al saggio
10,
Mercedes
De
Sánchez
Conservación,
Pons, e
the
alle due
essay by
pubblicazioni
Mercedes Sanchez
Graffiti
Pons,
Cookbook e
and
Street
the
Art
two
Cookbook,
books,
che
Street
contengono
Art Cookbook and Graffiti
molte dettagliate
Cookbook,
informazioni sulle tecniche
where you can find
brevemente
detailed
riassumute.
information on the techniques that I have just illustrated. Thank you.
Ci deve essere bloccato qualcosa?
I think that maybe something got stuck.
Puoi uscire dalla modalità.
Ti vediamo,
Perfetto.
ti vediamo,
Perfetto,
Ilaria.
grazie. Scusate, non mi vedevo. Grazie a Roberto
Thank
per
you, Roberto,
l'eccellente relazione. E,
for your
a questo
excellent
punto,
speech.
c'è un piccolo spazio per le domande.
So we have a
La
short
prima
session for
sicuramente,
questions.
anzi sono due, in realtà sono più di due, però Elisabetta Sonnino fa
We
un'altra
have
domanda a
several
Cavanna
questions.
Tibiletti sull'intervista loro
Elisabetta
tema,
Sonnino
se
for
può
Cavanna
fare, e in che modo,
Tibiletti
nello specifico,
on
parere
interviews
sulla
if
tollerabilità del
in
degrado.
their questionnaire
Distinguendo
there
appunto
is
la
the
tipologia dello
question
stesso degrado,
about the
tipo
artist's
vandalismo,
opinion
vandalismi
on
accidentali,
the
a volte
tolerability of the
questo
degradation,
l'interesse
if it's
dell'artista
caused
per
by
conservare
accidental
memoria come
damages or
accento
vandalism,
sulla proposta
and if
metropolitanizzata, scusate. E poi vengono fatti
and and then if this can be based on the difference between the interest of the artist in preserving the memory. And then always by Elisabetta Sonnino, the congratulations for your work method and the care in understanding and translating meanings and values. So first question is about the tolerability of degradation and if this was included in
Non
your
era
questionnaire.
inserita, in
No,
realtà.
it was
Ci
not
stiamo
included.
rendendo conto, strada facendo,
We
che
are
sarebbe
now
una domanda da
realizing
inserire. Tuttavia,
that
in
maybe
qualche
we
modo è
should
stato
add a
risposto,
question on this.
seppure
However,
non con una espressione così diretta, con una risposta diretta.
one of the answers included this
abbiamo chiesto in
topic
effetti cosa ne
because
pensassero delle
we asked them
superfetazioni
what
sui propri lavori.
they
E la
thought
risposta
about
è un po' di saccanismo, veramente. Cioè,
the
quindi, come dire, è la strada, attenzione, è la
where the
strada,
degradation of
non
their art.
sono i muri.
Their answer was, well, it's the
Questo,
street, it's
c'è
not the
una
walls.
differenziazione.
And so
Cioè,
there is a
se,
difference in that.
se c'è un vandalismo
So if there is
voluto come tale,
a vandalism
poco dopo che l'opera è stata fatta, a volte gli artisti che
deteriorating the work
dicono, "Magari
after
vado
it has been
di
made,
qualcosa faccio
the
io."
artists
Cioè,
that
provo
we
in qualche modo a
interviewed
sistemare.
answered, maybe I
Certo
go there
che
and try
se,
to fix it up
questo
myself.
quindi è riconosciuto come atto vandalico.
If it
Se
is
invece
recognized
c'è,
as
si pone la
vandalism,
situazione in una situazione intermedia
while
tra
if it's
mezzari di pintura, inconsapevolezza
in
di chi
the middle between
agisce l'atto, che
repainting
non ha
or
esattamente una volontà
the
vandalica, ma come dire,
vandal, so to say, that doesn't realize, he is deteriorating the work, or as Maria was saying, just as well to leave track, to leave a sign of his passage, or if the work is going through its process of deterioration, and then we leave the process going on. And so there is this trend to say we do not want to use any protective agents, because protecting the work with a specific substance is one thing, but protecting the work from writings, what they think is that what it's on the streets, it does not belong to anyone. And so it's in a way it is related to the freedom of act, even on a work, even if this implies vandalism. So they said we will not ask for help to conservators, but the reaction comes directly from the artist itself. Covering or overlapping are considered by the artists we interviewed, because they also mentioned that maybe they did it in their turn. And in the case of Volkswriters, where the covering were not made by the crew or by other artists,
anche in quel caso in cui appunto si trattava di segni offensivi.
In that case, it was more like a political symbol or the far right symbols. And in that case as well,
vediamo se troviamo esattamente la loro citazione, però
I try and see if I find exactly what they answered, their words. But on protective anti-writing, they say they are against the freedom of expression that is typical of a war. Maybe it can be something good if it's commissioned by a private client, but very often the protective agent also is very expensive. So there is also a topic of economic sustainability. And the duration of the work is considered as a relative thing.
Una cosa che tutto sommato degli Ortica che dicevano: io trovo che l'aspetto della democrazia della comunicazione sia importante dal loro punto di vista per chiunque apporti.
I think that that this is important for anyone who contributes with content. So the city walls shall not be privatized. Of course, now maybe we have to define what we mean by content, because what is a content for me, maybe for you, is vandalism. So the border shall be further developed. Ivan was saying
su cos'è per lui un protettivo, no? Rispetto a un eventuale
was explaining what is a protection against vandalism, and he said, to me, protection is invisible but essential to the eyes based on what I created my work. So, and of course, he was mentioning his relationship with the context. He was stressing the fact that his works were never covered or never were overlapping with other writing.
Chiunque possa avere il desiderio di porre un segno sopra le sue cose, quindi dice il protettivo in realtà è l'accettazione che
the protection is the fact that the work is accepted by the community.
dell'Ilva di Taranto.
And he was saying in Taranto, the Ilva factory, the only care and protection is the context, because there was a lady in relation to one of his works close to the Ilva factory walls. She dedusted the red powder because she was in love with the work, and so no conservator was needed because she went there herself because she loved this painting. So the protection comes from the bottom. Recognition and protection comes from the bottom.
Secondo noi è molto interessante questo.
An interesting answer.
Non so se abbiamo risposto.
Credo proprio di sì. Faccio un'ultima domanda.
One last
poi,
question.
Che in realtà sarebbe molto lunga da disquisire. Perché
A very
Chiara Raponi,
long one. Chiara Raponi
per quanto riguarda il
asks
murales di Niguarda,
if for the Niguarda murals for repainting they used Montana spray cans, and if there was a pre-discussion between artists and conservators on the use of materials, and if we had a direct experience or knowledge between material experts and artists, and if this impacted on the stability of the work right from the beginning, the production phase. We already mentioned this aspect, I think, and then we have to close our meeting. As for the Niguarda anti-fascist murals, the retouch made by the Volkswriters were already expected even before we came in the game. So we were not questioned about this. And they were influenced by the use of Montana sprays because they had a limited budget, and that was already pre-established. So in that case, we did not bring any contribution.
È un tema che è venuto fuori durante le interviste, non con tutti, ovvero quello della collaborazione.
The topic of collaboration between artists and conservators emerged during our conversation sometimes. They have recently started to deal with these conservation topics because the artists are usually involved by conservators and not the opposite, not the other way. So the feeling is, rather than conservators retouching the work, probably the idea of suggesting techniques and materials for good practices by conservators to the artists. This is welcomed as an approach. Pau, for example, asked us to create a kind of list of best practices for the creation of murals to improve its duration. We always refer to this idea of prolonging the duration, the life of an art, and not to make it eternal. While for Ivan, we saw that he already received this kind of consultancy by the enamel producers, and they also sponsor
che lui
his
utilizza dei materiali
performances.
piezza che sono di
He
buona qualità, ma lo
uses
può permettersi
materials, good quality
con
materials, when he can, of course,
budget
when he has
appunto,
a
che non può
budget,
sostenere e che ha un rapporto diretto con i
and he
rappresentanti di
has
questa
a
azienda
direct
che
relationship
l'hanno
with these
consigliato
companies,
su come
and
utilizzare,
they suggested how to use their products
migliorare, diciamo, le performance dei
to
materiali
improve material
e poi
performance
della durata
and, of course, the
dell'opera.
duration of the work.
Qualcos'altro da aggiungere?
Scusate, le domande sono altre due e sono piuttosto variegate, però piuttosto importanti, quindi vi chiederei magari di rispondere brevemente a entrambe. La prima
So we
è di
have
Maria Tsatsidakis.
two questions.
Ciao!
The first by Maria
Dice,
Tsatsidakis.
in caso di conservazione della street art,
So in the case of conservation of street art, partial repainting is usually accepted, and in some cases it is performed by the artists themselves. On the other hand,
diciamo invece del restauro che si rivolge alle opere
for
storiche,
historical
è assolutamente,
paintings,
non accettata.
it is not accepted as a conservation practice.
Collimare i due lati e le due visioni.
So, what do you think is the conservator's point of view that bridges the two sides?
Integrare una coscienza comune, plausibilmente.
I think we have to create a common and shared point of view. So it's a matter of cooperation, collaboration between the parties, because we have to consider that this reality is becoming a reality that must be protected and preserved. It's a heritage. And so in case we need to preserve and protect our heritage, of course, you have to involve many people in this process, like the cultural heritage institution, superintendency, and so on. So we are now understanding and better understanding what we need to do. I cannot give you an exact answer right now, so I would say to integrate a common feeling and based on dialogue, based on an exchange of experiences. If it's an historical painting, you do not maybe work on it. Maybe if it's an historical, you cannot reach the artist. If the artists are still there, maybe you cannot interact with them. We clearly felt that as conservators we were considered as potentially and dangerously invasive of their own community reality. And I think that is an ongoing situation, reality.
Perfetto, sì, penso che sia un qualcosa tra l'altro su cui riflettere.
So it's something that we have to think about it. There is not just one single answer. You have to consider the context, and these works are so complex, and we are still living this ongoing process, and we are still there, and we are close to this phenomenon. We cannot properly see all the aspects. There is not probably the historical framework to be supported in our decisions, and of course the interaction with the people is crucial, from the client to the artist to the community to the context. I think that we developed and analyzed all the different aspects, and I would like to thank all the speakers who took the floor today, because there was a perfect relay from one topic to the other, enhancing and enriching
le relazioni successive.
all the
Con le
speeches
domande si sono aggiunti davvero tanti
in a
dettagli.
mutual way.
Grazie anche all'ultima
And with the
relazione di
questions as well,
Roberto,
thanks
che è
to
stata
Roberto as well,
completissima dal punto di
which
vista sia dei
was
materiali, dal
really
punto di vista delle
detailed
tecniche,
from the
e
point of
che
view
ha
of
dato
materials and
spunto a
techniques,
un altro tipo di lettura,
which
di come
gave
anche
a
l'introduzione dei
different
materiali
way
sintetici
of
siano delle
understanding.
ragioni
So
che non
even
possono
when you
prescindere
use synthetic
dagli
materials, there are
aspetti
reasons
socioculturali.
that
Quindi questo
are
direi che è una
strictly
cifra
intertwined with the
a un
social
passaggio
and
forte anche
cultural
per le
aspects.
tipologie di opera che stiamo contemplando, e anche ovviamente il carattere sociale,
And of course, the
diciamo in qualche
social
modo
aspect
performativo,
and
di cui ci
the
si è letto molto bene anche
performing
dalla
aspect.
presentazione completissima
So
e
thank
molto
you for your
appassionante di Roberto,
detailed
per cui
presentation,
fanno
Roberto.
complimenti. Quindi grazie a tutti.
So
Adesso,
thank you.
vedo anche Dominique Scalarone,
I see
appunto
here Dominique
rappresentante di
Scalarone,
Trento, leader di progetto,
representing
che voleva ovviamente anche
the
lei
University of
partecipare ai
Turin
saluti
and
finali.
project leader if she wants to join me for the
Sì, grazie
the
Ilaria.
greetings, the
Non
final
posso
greetings.
che ripetermi nel ringraziare in primis
I would like to
tutti gli
stress
oratori di questa splendida
the
mattinata
importance
e
of the
ringraziare
speakers
ovviamente
and
tutti i partecipanti
would
per
like to
la
thank
loro
you all
attenzione, per
and
la
all the
loro
attendees
presenza.
for being with us.
Grazie Dominica, anch'io ringrazio i partecipanti.
Thank you on my side as well. Thank to all the attendees and thank you Elisa, our interpreter, for the translation and for being so precise. And I would like to thank Giacomo as well for his technical support. Because we often have a hard time with this digital context. So see you tomorrow morning.
Quello che non si è visto, diciamo, visivamente, però mi permetto di riproiettare un secondo la slide.
I would like to share once again
devo vedere se ce l'ho ancora visibile, però, perché
my slide.
poi io vedete tecnicamente, lo ripeto a voce così non
Or
tempo.
anyway, I repeat it.
Qualcuno voglia dei partecipanti
If you want, as an attendee, be
alla presentazione di ulteriori brevi casi
a panelist of the round table on Saturday during our round table sharing case studies, you can contact Cesmar 7 secretary, Cesmar7 at cesmar7.org by today. You can send us a short abstract of what you would like to say on Saturday as a panelist during our roundtable. So see you tomorrow morning at 9 here on Zoom with the technical aspects of public art conservation. I would like to thank all the speakers, Maria, Alessandra, Clara, Grazia, Roberto. And of course, if there are questions, maybe we can go in depth during the future days. And thank you. See you tomorrow.